Chapter 401. Keep talking. Don't stop. If you are tired, you might as well take a short rest. I will rub you and give you a massage to relieve your fatigue, with the idea of testing the quality for mastery. Jean Chuan served meticulously. An Shui had not enjoyed such meticulous care for a long time. This job was originally in charge of Xiangling. After she left, Tongxi and Tongui had to do it. But they were young and inevitably lacked some skills. This long-lost thoughtfulness made An Shui hard to refuse. You are a very skillful child. So I will trouble you. No trouble. Look at what Aunt said. I am a servant. If Aunt thinks that I am doing a good job, I can come here often in the future. Do you think the strength is suitable? An Shui moaned comfortably. As the saying goes, a man is like a wolf at 30 and a tiger at 40. She is not a young girl who does not know the world. She has been a widow for many years and has been lonely for a long time. It is inevitable that she is inconsolable. She is happy and noble. But she is young and does not understand the reason. In addition, she is a child of the Shui family. She is inevitably in awe of this lady. For the troubles that need to be solved, they often only dare to downplay and deal with them hastily. However, Jean Chuan holds the idea of making an outpost for her master. And the focus is deeply in line with An Shui's mind. She secretly speculates in her heart that although her sister is not like herself, she lost her husband early. But Jia Zheng's brother-in-law has been favoring Aunt Zhao for many years, which is not much better than herself. I'm afraid I can only rely on Jean Chuan's hands. Jean Chuan could hear her breathing getting heavier. Her hands were moving around the ravines and mountains intentionally or unintentionally. She leaned close to An Shui's ear and whispered softly, My aunt has never taken any special care of her skin. But her skin is as smooth as cream, tender and soft. If she soaks in the warm water of the master, I'm afraid it will be even more delicate. The girls will be jealous when they see it. An Shui groaned and quickly covered up. Then warm water has this effect? That's right, Jean Chuan said temptingly. If Madame can take a bath, she will definitely be much younger. I'm afraid it's not appropriate for me to go to your farm? What's wrong? Madame. How is Madame's complexion recently? In order to get close to her, she even skipped the prefix to and called her Madame again. Huh? An Shui said thoughtfully. From what you said, my sister's complexion is indeed much better than in previous years. Madame Wang's complexion has improved a lot. But it's not entirely due to the hot spring. However, this does not prevent Jean Chuan from boasting about the effects of the hot spring. Seeing that An Shui was quite interested, Jean Chuan persuaded her. To be honest, Madame, it was the warm water that gave Madame her current complexion. Last winter, she was so tired that she didn't want to come back. If Madame feels it's inconvenient to be alone, she can ask Madame to keep her company. I'm sure Master will welcome her. She thought for a moment and added, But now Aunt Yu is about to give birth, so I'm afraid she won't have time to greet Madame. The warm water is hot, and it's not as comfortable as in winter. Madame may have to wait until winter this year. Although she wanted to lay some groundwork, she hadn't gotten Zhang Yunyi's approval yet. She was worried that it would reveal that Madame Yu was pregnant, so she had to take precautions first, with Mrs. Wang's example. And An Shui still thinking about getting back in touch with Zhang Yunyi. She half-heartedly said, I'm moved by what you said. Next time, I'll ask my sister if it's really as immediate as you said. Can I deceive my wife? Jean Chuan calmly changed the subject. Do you think my massage is comfortable? Yeah. An Shui felt comfortable all over when she asked this question, and couldn't help but let out a muffled groan. Jean Chuan smiled and said, I'm not bragging. This bathtub is a bit too small. If my wife goes to the warm water, I will give you a good massage. At that time, with the effect of the warm water, my wife will be more than 10 years younger. An Shui felt more comfortable when she said this, and couldn't help but praise, You are really skillful. Kid, is it possible that my sister's complexion has improved, and it is also the credit of your skillful hands? Hearing Jean Chuan's confident words, An Shui doubted whether she had verified the effect on Mrs. Wang. Jean Chuan was slightly stunned when she heard the words, and then she realized that An Shui had misunderstood something. A hint of mischief flashed in her eyes. She suddenly bent down, ignoring the sleeves that slipped into the water, and reached down with both hands, and whispered to An Shui's ear, Not only the Madam, but even Mastery praised me for my dexterity. At the critical moment, An Shui suddenly heard Zhang Yunyi's name, and she couldn't help but tremble. What's wrong with the concubine? Jean Chuan asked this, but she didn't mean to let go. When Aunt Shui gradually calmed down, she realized it later and said, "Ah, it's my clumsy hands. I didn't expect the concubine to be so plump. And I didn't find it well. Please don't blame me." Concubine. Aunt Shui's face flushed. She wanted to blame her for being rash, but she couldn't bear to complain. In addition, she could only breathe, so she simply shook her head weakly. Seeing this, Jean Chuan turned a blind eye to Aunt Shui's embarrassment, put on a nonchalant look, walked around to her and said, "Auntie is too plump. It's not easy for me to rub her from behind. Why don't you put your legs up? It will be more convenient for me to serve you." As she said this, she ignored Aunt Shui's attitude. Like a puppet, she picked up her legs curled up in the bathtub and put them on the edge of the bathtub. Fong stretched out her hand, buried her head, and washed Aunt Shui. This bath took half an hour. When Jean Chuan helped Aunt Shui, who was dressed neatly, out of the bathroom, it was already dusk. Aunt Shui said a little embarrassedly, "You are all wet. Don't catch a cold. Take my clothes and change them first. Dry them before leaving." Jean Chuan quickly declined. "No, Auntie. It's kind. The master is coming back soon, and I'm in a hurry to go back." When she returned to Ning Mansion, she saw Zhang Yuni getting off the carriage. She quickly came closer and saluted, "Master." Zhang Yuni glanced at the water stains on her clothes, frowned slightly and said, "Since your clothes are wet, why are you running around? Aren't you afraid of catching a cold? Why don't you change into clean clothes quickly? I'll change right away." Jean Chuan quickly leaned close to his ear and whispered a few words. The more Zhang Yuni listened, the brighter his eyes became. When Jean Chuan finished speaking, he swallowed hard, put his arms around her waist, and said with a smile, "In that case, there is no rush to eat dinner. I will accompany you to change your clothes." He put his arms around Jean Chuan and walked straight to Lin Shui Pavilion. In Lin Shui Pavilion, Jean Chuan, who was in tattered clothes, lay on the bed, hesitating and speaking intermittently. "Just now, I forgot to tell you. I went to the concubine today. The water stains on my body were from when I was washing the concubine while she was bathing her." Zhang Yuni was stunned for a moment when he heard this, and Jean Chuan was able to catch her breath. She exhaled heavily and praised, "I didn't expect that the concubine's skin is so delicate at this age. I am ashamed of myself. It is not much worse than Miss Bao. Not only that, the concubine is a little different from ordinary people. She is fat and afraid of heat. She hasn't moved much in this season, but her body is covered with sweat beads. I took it off for her." She was talking about something, but she was suddenly bumped by Zhang Yuni and stumbled. She fell down and groaned. Zhang Yuni was listening attentively, but suddenly there was no more. He quickly approached and urged, "Hurry up, keep talking. Don't stop." Chapter 402 Volunteering. No one knows what Jean Chuan said and how much she said last night. All we know is that Zhang Yuni was in high spirits and had dinner at Lin Shui Jishuan, and then he rested here. However, after last night's experience, Jean Chuan was more certain that she had made the right bet. Taking the opportunity of getting up early to help Zhang Yuni get dressed, she suggested, "Master, I thought about it and realized that everyone has gone to the villa and there is no one to take care of the family. It would be more convenient for me to stay and send something." Although Jean Chuan's proposal was tempting, Zhang Yuni was a little hesitant. To be honest, he regretted it a little. If I had known that Jean Chuan had this awareness, she would have stayed by my side and been a life secretary to help share the pressure of time management, instead of having to find a reasonable excuse to explain to Xiangling like now. Seeing that he remained silent, Jean Chuan hurriedly said, "Miss Lin, if someone else sends her, I'm afraid she won't understand what you mean. As for Miss Bao, I promised to send 2 sets of clothes and a suspender skirt." She paused, looked up at Zhang Yuni and said, "Besides, if there is one, there will be another. The concubine has been away from home for a long time, and I've just become friends with her. If we can strike while the iron is hot, when she goes to the farm, you can just pretend to run into me when I'm serving her, and I'll make sure she'll be reluctant." Zhang Yuni raised his clenched fist to his mouth, coughed dryly, interrupted Jean Chuan's words, and said sanctimoniously, "It's really not right for no one to take care of the family. It just so happens that Mr. Zhen and his family are reluctant to give up the heir, so you can stay and help take care of it." He made the arrangement in the name of his son without hesitation. "Wow, I will definitely go out more often these days, so that I can find out the figure of the concubine as soon as possible, and then find time to make a nightgown for her. Jin Chuan showed a happy expression, and quickly agreed, and then said, "What about the second wife and Aunt Zhao? Tell them to wait in the evening." This answer made Jin Chuan somewhat disappointed. She was so keen to help Master Yi hook up with Aunt Shui. In addition to understanding the Master's intention, she also had the idea of making Mrs. Wang embarrassed. Aunt Shui and Mrs. Wang have the same figure, but she is slightly better than Mrs. Wang in age, skin, and style. As the saying goes, people in the same industry are enemies. With Aunt Shui, a younger choice, Mrs. Wang will only be the second wife of Ronghua Mansion. However, she did not dare to disobey Zhang Yunyi's intention. After serving Zhang Yunyi breakfast and waiting for him to go to the yamen, Jin Chuan came to Ronghua Mansion. Because of the agreement yesterday, Aunt Zhao was waiting in Rongqi Hall early. When she saw Jin Chuan, she hurriedly greeted her. "What did the master say? Get ready and go over early in the evening." After Jin Chuan said that, she winked at Yu Chuan and was about to go out and talk about family matters with her sister. But Aunt Zhao grabbed her and said, "I heard from Yu Chuan that you will stay outside the city in a few days." This matter had been arranged long ago. Although Jin Chuan had not mentioned it to Mrs. Wang and Aunt Zhao, she had to mention it to her sister. This was not a secret, and Yu Chuan did not deliberately hide it. But Aunt Zhao was concerned. "What's the matter? Is there something wrong?" Jin Chuan glanced at Aunt Zhao. "Huh?" Aunt Zhao turned around quickly, picked up 2 bundles from the chair, and handed them to Jin Chuan, saying, "Please take this with you, and ask the master to take it to Huaner when he goes to the fairy school." Yesterday, she hurriedly recommended herself to him, so she had this idea in mind. However, she did not expect Jin Chuan to visit suddenly, and she did not prepare in advance. In addition, Jin Chuan left too quickly, and she knew she would come again, so she waited until today to tell him. Jin Chuan glanced at Mrs. Wang and said, "It's not a big deal to help you take it when you pack your luggage, but this time I won't go with you, and I can't help you remind the master. You should serve the master well in the evening and tell him yourself." Aunt Zhao didn't think much of it, but Yu Chuan was a little anxious when she heard it. However, she didn't rush to ask, but looked at her sister with a worried look. For a maidservant, it is natural to be as close to the master as possible. She didn't know the reason, but she only knew that a few days ago, Jin Chuan vowed that she would stay at the villa with the team in a few days. Now she suddenly said that she couldn't go, so she was worried. Before Jin Chuan could say anything, she hurriedly took her out. "Sister, what's the matter? Didn't you agree to follow the master to the villa? Did you offend the master in some way?" As soon as she left Rongqi Hall, Yu Chuan asked several questions in a row. Jin Chuan smiled and comforted. "How could it be? Just relax. The master kept me at home because he had something important for me to do." She was afraid that her sister would worry, so she said confidently, "If these things are done well, the master will be happy and may promote your sister to be a concubine. Although concubine Yu is gentle, there is a difference between master and servant, so she will inevitably suffer some grievances. If I can be a concubine, you don't have to suffer with outsiders. Just come to me directly." "Really?" Yu Chuan turned from worry to joy, and said in disbelief, "Even Monsieur can only be a concubine for the master. With our status, we can still." To be honest, Jin Chuan was not sure in her heart, but in order to reassure her sister, she could only pat her chest and said, "Can I still lie to you? I'm not afraid to tell you. Not only Monsieur, but even the second lady will be a concubine for the master." "Ah?" Yu Chuan exclaimed, quickly covered her mouth, and looked around. Jin Chuan said confidently, "Even the girls in this mansion are only worthy of being a concubine for the master. Don't you think about what kind of status the master is now? How different are we from these ladies in the eyes of the master? Why would the master care about this? To put it in a taboo, if the emperor takes a concubine, why would he care whether the concubines in the harem are princes and nobles, or ordinary people?" What she said was not unreasonable. It is reasonable that as long as the status is high enough, the difference between 100 feet and 80 feet is not that big. To use the words of the previous life, whether you are poor or rich, you are all poor in my eyes. Yu Chuan is not as knowledgeable as Jin Chuan. In addition, in her eyes, although Mrs. Wang is humble and hard-working in front of Zhang Yuni, she is also willing to work hard. But it was also instructed by Jia Zheng. and she has not completely gotten rid of the deep-rooted view. But we are slaves after all. How can we compare with the young ladies? What's the matter? Although there is no precedent in our mansion, there are ready-made examples elsewhere. Jean Chuan glanced around and said in a low voice, the elder sister of Aunt Jun was originally a maid in her family. It was only because she was favored by Jia Yutsuan that the lady took her in as an adopted daughter. She was originally just a concubine, but now she has been promoted to be a concubine and a proper official wife. Originally, as a maidservant beside Xiangling, Jean Chuan was reluctant to say more about the right and wrong of the Jin family. But now, in order to gain the trust of her sister, she could not care less. Yu Chuan was skeptical when she heard this. Jean Chuan thought for a while and said, "Oh, right. Please help me keep an eye on the second wife. If the concubine asks her to accompany her to the master's manor to take a bath, whether she agrees or not, remember to tell me." Yu Chuan frowned and said, "What does it have to do with us whether she agrees or not? Why is my sister asking this? Did the master tell her? How could it be?" Jean Chuan denied it flatly. Although the second wife has obeyed the master, it is hard to say who she supports in her heart. We have to be on guard for the master. It's not that she doesn't believe her sister, but she is worried that she will let it slip. Yu Chuan knew that her sister still hated Mrs. Wang, and she just thought she was trying to make trouble for Mrs. Wang. Without any doubt, he replied, "Don't worry, sister. I will keep an eye on it." Chapter 403 A Critical Moment. The moon is on the branches. The silver light spreads all over the earth, like a white and soft silk, slowly unfolding. The birds on the treetops occasionally make a few crisp chirps, breaking the silence of the night sky. In the Grandview Garden under the moonlight, everything seems so harmonious. Only in the Qing-Tang thatched cottage, there are bursts of panting like bellows, destroying this rare harmony. I don't know how long it took. With the sound of 2 slaps, the cottage gradually returned to peace. Then came a series of rustling sounds. Didn't the master say that you can go home and rest for 2 days every month? It's been more than a month. Why hasn't water come back? Nothing will happen, right? Although Aunt Zhao's words were not without worry. Her voice was panting, and the lingering charm could not be concealed. Zhang Yuni was stunned by the question. He cared less about the men in Ronghua Mansion than he did about the women. Although he had just been to the Immortal Academy not long ago and taught the teachers for a few days, he had no time to care about Jia Huan, his adopted son. However, Jia Zheng, his biological father, rarely asked about it, so he didn't think there was anything wrong. Therefore, he didn't feel guilty at all, but instead scolded. A loving mother often spoils her son. What can happen in the school? Lida knew about this relationship. If something really happened, Lai Shangrong would not be able to hide it. Mrs. Wang also chimed in. If something really happened, how could Yuni not know? I think most of the time he was playing wild and forgot to go home. Although the present is different from the past, and he and Aunt Zhao are also on the same rope. The prejudice in his bones is difficult to change. Once she gets the chance, Mrs. Wang will not forget to sneer. She said this in line with what Zhang Yuni said, and Aunt Zhao did not dare to refute. She hurried forward to help Zhang Yuni put on his clothes and said, "Master, you are right. I am just worried about you. Today, I asked Jean Chuan to bring 2 sets of clothes. Please take them to Huaner when you go." "Yes. There is really no need to refuse such a small favor." Zhang Yuni nodded, pinched Aunt Zhao's waist, and said, "I will ask Jean Chuan later and ask her to take them out separately." He thought for a while and added, "Tell him again and ask him to come back during the holiday so that you don't always worry about him." Aunt Zhao was grateful when she heard this. She squatted down and hugged Zhang Yuni's legs, looking up and said, "If you are not satisfied, I will help you to relieve your worries." Zhang Yuni did not say anything, but just reached out and grabbed the back of her head. Turning her head to look at Mrs. Wang, she said, "When did you arrange someone to guard the east corner gate of this garden?" Mrs. Wang's face flashed with satisfaction, and she said, "I don't know. Phone girl is pregnant, and I don't have the energy to take care of it. So I handed the gate control of the mansion to the third girl. This is probably her arrangement." As she spoke, she looked at Aunt Zhao, who was squatting on the ground and grunting. Although Aunt Zhao was working hard and didn't see her movements, she listened carefully to her words. Although the job was arranged by Mrs. Wang, Tancheng was her daughter after all. She secretly cursed Mrs. Wang for killing 1,000 enemies and losing 800 of her own. She was hesitating whether to pay the debt of the daughter to the mother, continue to atone for the crime, or defend Tanchun, when she suddenly realized that the hands behind her head were removed, and she quickly stood up and complained. Why is this girl still on guard against the master? I will tell her tomorrow to remove the gate control here. At this point, she looked at Mrs. Wang and said in return, Madam, how can you leave such a matter to a maid who is ignorant of the world? Besides, why is it necessary to set up this access control in the mansion? Isn't it causing trouble for the master? Mrs. Wang didn't expect the counterattack to come so quickly. To be honest, she was very satisfied with Tanchun's arrangement, and she was even more reluctant to remove the access control. Just when she regretted shooting herself in the foot and was in a dilemma, she saw Zhang Yuli waving his hand and said, Forget it. It's set up, and removing it again will make you look guilty. He put down his collar, tied his belt, and changed the subject. However, I have been delayed for a long time since I came in. It's getting late. You should go back early, so as not to let those who are interested see the clues. After that, he left straight away, left behind Mrs. Wang and Aunt Zhao, staring at each other with disgust. From Jia Jing's side, Mrs. Wang is indeed in the upper hand, but now the person in charge of Ronghua Mansion has long changed. From Zhang Yuni's perspective, it's hard to tell who's better. Originally, Aunt Zhao was still thinking about keeping things quiet, but today, Madame Wang took the initiative to provoke her, so she was too lazy to deal with it. The two of them didn't say a word, ignored each other, and were busy with their own things. After packing up, they left the Qingtang hut one after the other. As soon as they left the hut and walked along the bamboo fence path, they saw two dark shadows coming towards them in the dark. The two were caught off guard and couldn't avoid them. The person on the other side was also startled. After seeing clearly, she saluted and said, Madam, Aunt, what are you doing? Madame Wang saw Tanchun and her servant on the other side, and she felt regretful and a little guilty. She said fiercely, What are you doing here? Why don't you even light a lantern? She was so busy scolding Tanchun that she forgot that she and Aunt Zhao were also acting in the dark. Fortunately, Tanchun was also guilty, and it was impossible for her to question her elders. So she had to bite the bullet and say, Mother told me to take charge of the door control, and I dare not neglect it. I heard that Brother E entered the garden earlier, so I came out for a walk. Speaking of this, she looked at Mrs. Wang and the others and said carefully, I walked around everywhere and didn't see Brother E. Mother and Aunt, did you run into him? It's not that she saw Mrs. Wang's intention to let her take charge of the door control, but she came out in the dark at night and was caught in the act, so she had to explain it in this name. After all, she is not Wang Shifeng, who has been a housekeeper for many years and has maids and servants who can be used for dispatch. There are not many people she trusts, and it is not enough to take turns to watch the east corner gate for 12 hours a day, let alone the main gate. In addition, it is not easy for her to ask the servants to report to her when the elders come in and out. It is unknown when Lady Wang and Aunt Zhao entered the garden. Lady Wang was somewhat relieved by this answer. At the same time, she was relieved to hear that Tanchun had wandered around. She was about to say that she had never seen Tanchun and sent her away, but she saw that she frowned and looked towards the Qingtang cottage intentionally or unintentionally. Lady Wang's heart tightened. She couldn't help wondering if what she did had been seen by Tanchun. How could she know that Tanchun was not lying? When she heard that Zhang Yuni had entered the garden, she immediately thought that he was looking for Yuanchun. After thinking about it, she finally found an excuse and rushed to the Grandview Tower. Unexpectedly, she came up empty-handed. This, instead of reassuring her, aroused her curiosity. At that moment, she went to Toby Villa again, followed Henwu Garden, and circled around the Grandview Tower. After leaving Xiaoxiang Pavilion, she didn't see Zhang Yuni's figure, and she couldn't help but speculate secretly. Did Zhang Yuni know that she was in charge of the door control, and he missed her, so he went to Qingtang Hut to wait for her? So, she hurried here, but she didn't expect to run into Mrs. Wang and Aunt Zhao. Mrs. Wang didn't know. She had known about this place from Aunt Zhao. It happened that the two had always been at odds, and Tanchun knew that Aunt Zhao had met Zhang Yuni here in private. At this moment, seeing Aunt Zhao following behind Mrs. Wang, she didn't say a word, just thought that she was caught by Mrs. Wang and grabbed her pigtail on the spot. So, while looking at Aunt Zhao, She also glanced at Qingtang Hut, hoping to get some hints from Aunt Zhao's eyes. Mrs. Wang and Tan Chun each had their own ulterior motives, but Aunt Zhao's heart was as clear as a mirror. Originally, Mrs. Wang was targeting her, and she was happy to fight back and embarrass Mrs. Wang. But when she heard Tan Chun ask about Zhang Yuni, she remembered the scene of letting go before. She knew her daughter's thoughts and Zhang Yuni's calculations, and it was not difficult to see that he did not want Tan Chun to know the inside story. Thinking of this, she hurried forward and said bluntly, "You are such a heartless person. Why don't you calculate how long your brother has been in the immortal school? If you don't think of him as your own brother, how can I not think of my son?" Jean Chuan came to see her sister today. I heard that Mastery would stay at the manor in a few days, so I asked her to invite Mastery to come over so that she could bring some things. Madame was worried and came with him. Now everyone has left. If you want to find him, go to the East Palace by yourself. Don't be here, using chicken feathers as a token of authority and asking questions. After hearing her scolding, Tan Chun breathed a sigh of relief. Auntie is in serious trouble. She turned to Mrs. Wang and said, "I dare not. But it is my duty. Since brother Yi has gone back, I will send mother and aunt back now." She dared to doubt Aunt Zhao, but she did not dare to doubt Mrs. Wang. Moreover, if Mrs. Wang was not upright, she would not leave Yuan Chun, the legitimate daughter, and used, and let herself, a concubine, take charge of the door control. Mrs. Wang saw that she did not hold on to it, and was covered up by Aunt Zhao in a few words, and she could not help but breathe a sigh of relief. She waved her hand and said, "No need. It's dark. You should go back earlier." Tan Chun did not dare to stay, and hurriedly said goodbye and turned away. When she left, Mrs. Wang could not help but soften her body. Aunt Zhao saw this and sneered. "I helped you cover it up this time, but there won't be a next time. I don't care. If the lady is seen by others, this person will be in big trouble. I think you should remove this girl's job as soon as possible, so as not to shoot yourself in the foot." She was not really thinking about Mrs. Wang, but if she allowed Tan Chun to take advantage of her position and rush around like this, if she caught Zhang Yuni's good deeds one day, it would inevitably offend him. When the disaster comes, it will be too late to regret it. She thought that after this incident, Mrs. Wang would probably go with the flow and remove Tan Chun's job. Unexpectedly, when she put the words to her lips, Mrs. Wang did not respond, but kept silent and hurried on her way. Aunt Zhao was slightly startled. Then she seemed to realize something. A teasing look flashed across her face. She looked at Madame Wang, who was walking slowly in front of her. Her eyelids twitched, and she quickly followed her. Chapter 404, Encountering Exclusion. March 1st. Zhang Yuni handed Jin Qingxi over to Jin Shirin and his wife, bid farewell to the two elders in Jinchuan, and then took Xiangling and others to the hot spring villa. After sending the girls to the villa, he chatted with Yusher, who was pregnant, while unloading the luggage, and accompanied the girls to have lunch. After the luggage was unloaded, Fong took the two bags that Jin Chuan had brought out and rushed to the Xianxue without stopping. The number of teachers and students in the Xianxue is limited now, with only about 500 students. He divided it into 10 classes according to the classes in his previous life. There is one class for the children of ministers and nobles, and 9 classes for the children of craftsmen. The reason for this division: first, teach students in accordance with their aptitude. The children of ministers and nobles are different from the children of craftsmen. They can all read and write, and do not need to make up for the education of cultural courses. Secondly, in ancient times, the hierarchy was strict, and he was worried that these dandies with good family backgrounds would bully children from poor families. Of course, this is only a stopgap measure. In his plan, he would have to redivide them according to the learning situation in the future. The organizational structure of Xianxue follows the structure of the Imperial Academy. However, it is not as high as the Imperial Academy in terms of rank. He concurrently serves as the chief priest of Xianxue, with a rank of 4th rank, and under him is a 5th rank Sai, which is currently vacant. There are 3 6th rank supervisors, who are in charge of teaching affairs, administration, and discipline. There are also several teaching staff of various ranks, including doctors, assistant teachers, and schoolmasters. However, except for a group of teachers who he worked overtime and specially trained last year, they have been promoted according to the situation, and most positions have not yet been filled. There is only Lai Shangrong as the supervisor. who is basically in a state of single-handed control. On the one hand, there is really no suitable manpower. On the other hand, he intends to find a good one and make this place his own private land. However, although there are not many teachers and students for the time being, the land and the scale of the building are really not small. The canteen, teaching area, dormitory area, and experimental area all have their own independent areas. Zhang Yudi did not make any special arrangements. He got off the car at the gate, carrying 2 bags, and walked in. Just halfway through the journey, Lai Shangrong heard the news and rushed over, and quickly snatched the bag from his hand. Zhang Yudi asked, "How has Jia Huan performed since he entered school?" "Not bad." Lai Shangrong first gave a mediocre evaluation. "Oh!" Zhang Yudi was a little surprised. Lai Shangrong hurriedly explained, "The courses taught by Xianxue are not much different from playing for them, especially the experiments arranged by adults, which are really novel." "That's true. Mathematics may be a bit boring, but the knowledge of physics and chemistry is quite fresh for these ancient children." In addition, he advocated combining theory with practice, and teaching with fun. Compared with the 10 years of studying for the imperial examination, it is not an exaggeration to say that it is half learning and half playing. "Take me to see him." Zhang Yuli nodded. "He didn't go back last month, and An Zhao asked me to bring some things to him." Lai Shangrong bent over. "It's lunch break now. Most of them are in the school, although Zhang Yuli arranged 2 days of rest per month for the students, except for those dandy boys who would go home to take a look and relax. The children of craftsmen basically chose to stay in school. After all, it costs money to go home for meals. Eating and drinking well here not only saves money, but also allows you to seize time and study hard." Zhang Yudi had said before that the best students would be selected to be teachers, and those without much talent would be sent to Tiangong Academy. Although the treatment in Tiangong Academy was not low for these children of craftsmen, once they were kept, no matter what their rank was, it was a class leap. The environment could affect people. Although those dudes were used to being casual, the children of craftsmen accounted for the majority. Although they were not in the same class, most of them seized every moment. In addition, most of these ministers and noble children were illegitimate children of their families. Before coming here, they were warned by their elders, so they were embarrassed to be too free and casual. Over time, waiting for class in the school after lunch became a trend. "Sir," before walking to the teaching area, Lai Shangrong suddenly hesitated. "What's wrong?" Lai Shangrong said with a stiff face. Although Mr. Huan Sen performed well, he was excluded in the school. After that, he looked at Zhang Yudi cautiously. As the supervisor of teaching, administration, and discipline, Jia Huan was arranged by Zhang Yudi. He was naturally aware of this situation. It's not that he deliberately concealed it. It's just that Zhang Yudi didn't care about it since he arranged Jia Huan to enter the school. Although these dudes are illegitimate children, their family background is there. Lai Shangrong can't afford to offend them. He also knows Zhang Yudi's attitude, so he pretends not to know. Now, seeing Zhang Yudi bringing things, he is worried that he will be caught by him, so he has to bite the bullet and tell the truth. "Exclusion?" Zhang Yudi muttered to himself. He immediately understood the reason. The upper leads the lower. Although the king of Qin is more secretive in doing things, the ministers in the court are clearly divided. The elders in the court are clearly divided. And these juniors naturally follow suit in the immortal school. It just so happens that Ronghua Mansion failed to get close to Ning Wang, and was disliked by Ning Wang. It is not surprising that Jia Huan is in a worrying situation here. However, these are not the reasons for Lai Shangrong to conceal. Zhang Yudi looked at him meaningfully. Lai Shangrong was so scared that his neck shrank, and he quickly explained, "I didn't mean to deceive. But the leaders were Wu Qi and Zhou Huaid. I was worried that the adults would be embarrassed, so I just made some sarcastic remarks." Although Lai Shangrong didn't know the inside story, he knew the identities of Zhou Qinru and Wu Qi very well. One of these two people's families clearly stood on the side of Ning Wang, and the other sister was the concubine of Qin Wang. He couldn't suppress them. If they were the elders of these children, Zhang Yudi might have given them some face. But there was no need to spoil a few bastards. He knew very well that the reason why these illegitimate sons of officials were sent to the immortal school was not necessarily because the elders in the family value the immortal school itself, but most of them just to show their support for him. In this case, he would not offend him because of such a small matter. Zhang Yudi wanted to give Lai Shangrong some confidence, and said calmly, "They are just illegitimate sons. What's the embarrassment? Those who disobey discipline will be expelled. If anyone has any objections, let his father come to me." "Hey! Hey!" Lai Shangrong responded quickly. "Zhang Yuni knocked again. I promoted you to be the supervisor. So you just do your job well. If the sky falls, I will support you. Don't think about those things." It's not that he takes special care of Jia Huan, but Jia Huan is also from Rongwa Mansion, and his status is equal to theirs. Once this trend is encouraged, I am afraid that they will have no more concerns when treating the children of craftsmen in the future. Yes, I understand. Let's go! Go and see. Chapter 405 Fame. Although he wanted to see Jia Huan's situation, Zhang Yuni was not in a hurry to go there. Instead, he went to the school of the children of craftsmen first and inspected them one by one. Looking at the students who were studying hard, he nodded with satisfaction. But when he came to the school where the group of dandies were, he couldn't help but frown slightly. Compared with the previous 9 schools, this place seemed quite noisy. However, not everyone was idle. There were still a few people working hard at their desks. He imitated the class teacher in his previous life and stood outside the window to look inside, but was surprised to find that Jia Huan, who was sitting in the front seat, had a balance in front of him and was fiddling with the weights on it. He was about to go in through the front door. Suddenly, Zhou Huai, who was sitting next to Jia Huan, poked Jia Huan with his arm and said with a smile, "Hey, third brother Huan, let me ask you something." Jia Huan was stunned, turned his head and saw Zhou Huai approaching him. Jia Huan happily said, "What is it?" After all, they were all children in their teens, and although they felt that they were being excluded, they still wanted to get closer. Unexpectedly, Zhou Huai suddenly stood up, shouted in the classroom, turned around and said to everyone in the school with a smile, "Didn't your father stay in the government office all day last year? And your eldest sister wanted to be a concubine to His Royal Highness Prince Ning? Why is it rumored that she is going to remarry the Lord Jizhou now?" Ha ha! When he said this, the school suddenly burst into laughter, and even the few people who were buried in their books raised their heads. The third brother Huan's family has a good plan. Since they can't climb up to His Royal Highness Prince Ning, they turn around and hug our Lord Jizhou's thigh. However, how can a woman marry 2 husbands? I think this is just the wishful thinking of the Rongwa Mansion. We don't know what happened, so why not ask the third brother Huan to tell us what happened? Zhang Yuni didn't believe that these bastards dared to interfere in the affairs of Prince Ning. In addition, Zhou Huai was the leader, and most of the people who agreed were from Prince Ning's faction. I'm afraid it was intentional. It's not difficult to understand that Prince Ning probably saw the Emperor's intention and deliberately added fuel to the fire to eliminate the suspicion of colluding with Wang Zizeng. If it were something else, the Qin Wang faction would probably come forward to refute it. But now, they are happy to watch the fun. Faced with the sarcasm of the crowd, Jia Huan didn't react much. He said indifferently, "I was raised by my aunt, and my elder sister was born by my wife. How could you tell me this?" Zhou Huai and others were stunned. They thought that Jia Huan would be so angry about this kind of sarcasm, but they didn't expect that it was just a punch on cotton and there was no ripple. Zhang Yuni couldn't help but laugh. Jia Huan didn't know that Aunt Zhao and Mrs. Wang had already had a relationship of fighting together. Although they were both from the second house of Rongfu, they were always incompatible. Jia Huan was influenced by them, so how could he empathize with Jia Baoyu and Yuan Chun? However, Jia Huan's words angered everyone. The people in the school are all bastards. Aren't they raised by ants? Although he was speaking his mind and speaking his mind, in the ears of everyone, it was undoubtedly a sarcasm of killing 1,000 enemies and hurting 800 of himself. Wu Qi was the first one who couldn't hold it in any longer. His sister was the highest-ranking concubine of the king of Qin, so he immediately stood up and said, "Speaking of this, I remember hearing an interesting story when I went home this time. I heard that our Lord Jizhou was also a guest of the Zhongchuan prince." He paused and said in a pretentious tone, "Although the master does not like to exchange, he accepts all comers. Your family is next door to the master of the wine, so you must have a deep friendship. Did your father ask your mother to entertain the master? That's why he made an exception and let your cheap son enter the school?" The enrollment was over before the new year, and Jia Huan was a transfer student. This is also one of the reasons why he was excluded. Zhou Huai talked about Yuan Chun, and Jia Huan didn't react. But when it comes to Aunt Zhao, he can't keep calm. However, he didn't dare to go up and tear it, but his little face turned red. Zhang Yuni couldn't help touching his nose when he heard it. He originally had the mentality of watching the show, and planned to wait until the matter became a big deal, just to kill the chicken to scare the monkey. Unexpectedly, this fire actually burned on his head. Good news doesn't go out, but bad news spreads 1,000 miles. And Wu Qi, this kid, actually hit the nail on the head. Lai Shangrong, who was following behind him, was also stunned. He then rushed into the school and shouted, "Shut up." He rushed into the school with 2 bundles in his hands. He glared at the troublemakers and handed the bundle to Jia Huan, saying, "This is what your mother asked the chief priest to bring to you." Wu Qi just found a random excuse to ridicule Jia Huan, and he might not think it was true, but Lai Shangrong knew it well. He didn't know that Zhang Yuni was worried that the children of craftsmen would be bullied. He just thought that he was hitting him because Jia Huan was excluded, so he wanted to make up for his crime. He was worried that he couldn't suppress these dandies from aristocratic families, and when he heard Wu Qi's seriousness, he simply used the tiger skin as a banner. However, this undoubtedly confirmed what Wu Qi had just said, which made Zhang Yuni laugh and cry. Lai Shangrong's shout also exposed Zhang Yuni's whereabouts. The students in the school did not take Lai Shangrong seriously, but they were all frightened and looked at Zhang Yuni outside the window. The school was silent. Zhang Yuni saw that there was no escape, so he had to bite the bullet and walked in. He cleared his throat, flicked his sleeves, and shouted, "Your family sent you here. Is it to let you make up stories, spread rumors, and exclude your classmates? Students dare not." The students in the school were all obedient, especially Wu Qi, who just said something behind his back. Before they entered the immortal school, they were all warned by their families. "Don't dare? I think you are very brave." Zhang Yuni looked around and said in a deep voice, "Don't say I didn't warn you. I'll remember this time. If I hear it again, you will exclude your classmates, whether they are children of craftsmen in the same class or other classes, and you will all get out of the fairy school." If it was just Jia Huan, he would definitely kill the chicken to scare the monkey. But now that it involves him, it is too strict, and it is inevitable that he will be suspected of abusing public power for personal gain. He can only hold it high and let it go lightly, and say the ugly words in advance. However, he is also worried that the punishment is too light and counterproductive. He turned to Lai Shangrong and said, "If you do it again, you will just chase them away." With these words, Lai Shangrong straightened his back unconsciously and said, "Yes, sir." Then, Zhang Yuni pointed at the few people who had just spoken and said in a deep voice, "Wu Qi, Zhou Huai, I think you guys have not vented your energy. Get out now and run around the immortal school for 20 laps before you come back." The School of Immortals covers a large area. For these dudes, running 20 laps would make them tired to death or even skinned. This was a small punishment. After the treatment was completed, he stepped out of the school, because he saw that Lai Shangrong had some misunderstanding. He warned him to pay more attention and not let the craftsman students be bullied. The students who stayed in the school looked at each other in bewilderment. Then, they gathered around Jia Huan and began to get close to him, although he tried his best to avoid the suspicion of using public power for personal gain. Lai Shangrong's unnecessary actions inevitably made the students speculate, since the family ordered that Zhang Yuni should not be offended. Jia Huan, the chief son, would naturally rise with the tide because of his mother's status. Looking at his classmates who usually ignored him, they started to get close to him one by one. Jia Huan couldn't help but have an extremely absurd idea. It seems that there is nothing wrong with having such a cheap father to protect him. Instead of explaining for Aunt Zhao, he accepted it calmly. This undoubtedly confirmed the speculation of these students. Chapter 406, Filial Piety is Commendable. "Auntie, my brother is back." Inside the room, Auntie Zhao, who was sitting on the Kong and applying cardamom on her toes, stood up suddenly after hearing the words. As soon as she put on her shoes, Jia Huan rushed in. "Oh, you conscienceless little bastard. You finally knew to go home? How did you come back? You didn't even send someone to tell me in advance?" Auntie Zhao complained to herself, and walked forward quickly, raised her hand, raised it high and gently, and placed it on Jia Huan's head. Jia Huan twisted his neck, shook Auntie Zhao's hand off his head, and complained, "Mom, how can you call your son a bastard?" In modern times, the word bastard is also an insult. but it more often refers to a child who is naughty and annoying, and is not much different from the wantonness of a bear child. But in ancient times, the meaning was very different. A rabbit gets pregnant by looking at the moon. A woman gets pregnant without a husband. The meaning of the rabbit is self-evident. Bah, Aunt Zhao said disapprovingly. You crawled out of my intestines. Even if I say it, what can it do? As she said that, she slapped Jia Huan on the shoulder, and turned to Xiao Jixiang and said, Quick! Go and get a cup of tea. You must be thirsty after walking so far. Right? Although there are still some disputes with Mrs. Wang. They are just some bumps and bumps. Not to the point of tearing the face. With Zhang Yuni in the middle to coordinate, it is impossible to make trouble over such a small matter as the carriage frame. Therefore, she did not get the news in advance when Jia Huan came back. It must be that he did not send someone back to call a car to pick him up, and just thought he walked back. What do you mean by walking or not? Today is the day off in the school, and the school has a car to take us. Since the school starts on the 16th day of the first lunar month, the holiday is also scheduled for the middle of the month. Although Jia Huan and other officials' children are illegitimate children, they are not short of carriages. The reason why Zhang Yuni arranged carriages is actually for the children of craftsmen. More than 10 people squeeze into one carriage and are sent to various directions inside and outside the city. If it were in the past, Jia Huan would naturally not be willing to squeeze into a carriage with others. But since Zhang Yuni supported him, he has become a star-studded existence in the immortal school. Jia Huan, who has always had little sense of existence, enjoys the feeling of being surrounded by people. So he did not send a message home, but instead asked a few good friends to ride with him and enjoy the flattery along the way. Thinking of his complacency during this period, he quickly turned around and looked at Xiao Jixiang, who was about to pour tea at the door, and said, I'll talk to mother for a while. You don't need to serve here. As he said that, he pushed Aunt Zhao to sit on the con, and then asked with a gossipy face, Mom, have you slept with Brother Yi? You? Aunt Zhao originally saw him pushing her to sit down, and thought he was just being filial. Unexpectedly, he asked such a disobedient question, and was stunned. Jia Huan said to himself, Mother just called my son a bastard. Could it be that my son is the child of you and Brother Yi? Aunt Zhao came to her senses and said shyly, How old was he when he gave birth to you? She wanted to avoid the main point and cover up this matter. Unexpectedly, Jia Huan was somewhat disappointed, shaking his head and saying, That's true. Alas, what a pity. Pooh. Aunt Zhao spat. What nonsense are you talking about? Did you hear some rumor somewhere? She couldn't understand why Jia Huan suddenly asked such a disobedient question, so she thought of asking indirectly. But Jia Huan heard the trick. A strange look flashed across his disappointed eyes. He smiled and asked, So it's true? Aunt Zhao raised her hand and poked Jia Huan on the forehead, and said unhappily, What's true or false? I'm asking you. Jia Huan reluctantly told the story of what happened when Zhang Yuni went to the school to deliver a bag half a month ago. At the end, he said with regret, It's a pity that he is not my son's father. Otherwise, bah! And Zhao slapped him on the head and spat. If he is your father, can you still call him brother? Wouldn't it mess up the generations? She scolded Jia Huan, but she felt very relieved. She secretly thought that she really did not follow the wrong person. She could take care of Jia Huan like this. Although he was not her biological father, he was 100 times better than Jia Zheng, her biological father. And it was not in vain that she worked hard and humbled herself. My son wants to change his words. At this point, he looked at Aunt Zhao with expectation and asked, Mother, tell my son quickly. Is the rumor outside true? Did the master ask you to sleep with him? Last year, the master was promoted and there were rumors in the mansion that. It's not that Jia Huan had to dig deep. However, Wu Qi didn't dare to make up rumors after seeing Zhang Yuni's attitude. So he had to explain to Jia Huan privately that he was talking nonsense. Disappointed, Jia Huan had to ask Aunt Zhao, What's the master or not? Aunt Zhao said with complacency, That was your mother's own idea. Sensing Jia Huan's attitude of being proud of it, Aunt Zhao no longer concealed it. On the one hand, from Jia Huan's words, it is not difficult to hear that he was not well received in school before, and wanted to give her son more confidence. On the other hand, her only concern originally was Jia Huan's reaction. Now, even her son was looking forward to recognizing this cheap father. so she simply went with the flow. Really? Jia Huan jumped up 3 feet high, unable to hide his joy, and said, "Then I'm relieved." And Zhao saw that he was a little too much, and was worried about causing trouble for Zhang Yuni. So she quickly warned him, "Your mother has been humble, and worked hard to earn this respect for you. Don't cause trouble for Master Yi in school, and ruin the relationship between mother and him." Jia Huan was quite sensible, and said seriously, "Don't worry, mother. I'm working very hard. I was praised the other day. I will never cause trouble for you." And Zhao said in disbelief, "Then why didn't you come back last month? Did you make a mistake in school and were punished by not being allowed to go home? How could it be? My son was a little late in school, but he stayed in school to make up for the missed courses for 2 days. Didn't he come back this month? He was a little reluctant to leave the fairy school, and he came back more to inquire about the news, as if worried that Aunt Zhao would not believe him." Jia Huan put his hands behind his back and raised his neck and said, "Hydrogen, helium, lithium, beryllium, boron, carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, fluorine, neon. My son has memorized the periodic table by heart now." Aunt Zhao's charming face twitched twice, and she asked with a puzzled look, "What is this? It's like chanting a sutra. What's so good about it? Is this what you learn in school?" "What do you know?" Jia Huan said proudly. "This thing was taught by my chief father himself. There are many changes in it, and the pull and pulley can save a lot of effort, which can be calculated clearly." He talked freely, and Aunt Zhao was confused. However, although she didn't understand what Jia Huan said, she knew that it was Zhang Yuni who taught him personally. Seeing that he spoke so clearly, she couldn't bear to discourage his enthusiasm. She just thought about asking Zhang Yuni privately. Chapter 407 Concealment. Oh, Madam, please keep your voice down. Don't let anyone hear it." In the northeast corner, in the bathroom of Shue's courtyard, Jean Chuan smiled and took her hand out of the bathtub, shaking off the water stains on her hand calmly. The water drops hit Aunt Shue's face. She recovered, blushed, and said with embarrassment, "You kid? You said you would only serve me a bath. Why did you do it again?" Jean Chuan walked around behind Aunt Shue. A hint of sarcasm flashed across her face, pressed her hand into the ravine, and smiled, "Madam, please put your heart in your stomach. I have served you like this. How can I not understand your intentions?" Jean Chuan did not lie, but Aunt Shue didn't know that she was not in Madame Wang's room. But when Zhang Yuni was too busy, I heard that her sister Madame Wang had also experienced such an experience, and Aunt Shue's guilt and anxiety were relieved a lot. "Praise you, child. You can guess the master's mind." Jean Chuan glanced at Aunt Shue, who was limp in the bathtub with contempt, secretly complaining in her heart. It's true that she knows how to guess the master's mind, but she is not your sister. But she said, "By the way, Aunt Yu is about to give birth in the next few days. When there is news from there, I will also go to the villa with Master Zhen. Why doesn't the aunt take this opportunity to accompany the mistress and go together? The warm bath will make your bones and muscles numb. If I serve the aunt comfortably, the effect will surely be doubled, making the aunt more than 10 years younger." Although Zhenshurine did not go with her, he was about to give birth and needed a doctor to take care of her. He was undoubtedly the most suitable candidate. Last time, Jean Chuan didn't ask Zhang Yuni, but this time she had a clue in her mind and came to instigate. And Shue had no idea that she had evil intentions. She originally hoped to get close to Zhang Yuni by congratulating him, and she was so moved by Jean Chuan's service that she could only nod her head. So how could she refuse? Jean Chuan knew the principle of striking while the iron was hot. So she hurriedly helped Aunt Shue out of the bathtub, carefully helped her dry her body, and after she put on her clothes, she said goodbye. "Then I won't delay Aunt Shue from going to say hello to Madam." As the birth was imminent, it was better to take a ride sooner rather than later. So Aunt Shue went straight to Rongqi Hall. The two sisters held hands and sat down on the Kong. Aunt Shue said straight to the point, "I heard that Aunt Yu in Yiger's room is about to give birth. I want to accompany you to congratulate her." Mrs. Wang's mouth twitched, patted Aunt Shue's chubby hand, and smiled. "Anyway, the baby is 1 month old, and we have to go to congratulate them. Why do you have to run back and forth?" Aunt Shue was a little surprised to hear this. She thought Mrs. Wang would be eager for her to accompany her, but she didn't expect that she would persuade her. She was confused and hesitated for a moment, but she still said in a roundabout way, "Recently, the seasons have changed. and I feel a little tired and lack energy. I heard that the warm water on the farm has some effect in relieving fatigue. It's a good opportunity to take a bath with my sister to relieve it. This, Mrs. Wang's face flashed with reluctance, and she exhaled heavily, saying insincerely, "You don't know. This round trip is at least 20 or 30 miles. I don't plan to go. I will go to congratulate the baby after the baby is 1 month old." Fearing that her reason was not sufficient, she added, "The manor is still outside the city. If you miss the time, you can't go back to the city. Now that the master is not at home, it's better to be more cautious." Yuchuan, who was standing by, heard it clearly and looked up at Mrs. Wang in surprise. Mrs. Wang was full of annoyance and did not notice Yuchuan's strange eyes. If Aunt Shui hadn't intervened, she would naturally be eager for such a legitimate opportunity. However, Aunt Shui had to find her to go with her. Not to mention, with Aunt Shui present, there was no chance to touch secretly. One learns from one's mistakes. At the hot spring villa, Jin Chuan and Yuchuan had caught her doing something. After all, Jin Chuan and Yuchuan were the maids around her and Zhang Yuni, so they could still cover it up. But if Aunt Shui saw it, how could she hold her head up in the future? It would be fine if it affected her reputation. After all, this was tacitly approved by Jia Zheng, and Aunt Shui was her sister, so she wouldn't gossip about it. But she still wanted to marry into the Shui family, and if it affected Jia Bayu's marriage, she would regret it. Unfortunately, Zhang Yuni was a person who didn't care when he was interested, so she had to give up this legitimate opportunity. Madame Wang had said so much, and Aunt Shui's widowhood had to avoid melon fields and plums. Although she was unwilling, she had to give up. Just at this moment, Saixia came in and reported, "The old lady wants you to come over." This gave Mrs. Wang a reason to send the guest away, and she quickly stood up and said, "I'll be right there. Madam, please ask Saixia to accompany you to the old lady's place. I have something to do and need to go home." If it were any other maid, they would not dare to say such a thing. But Yuchuan didn't care. She did not forget Jin Chuan's instructions, and was in a hurry to report the news. Mrs. Wang did not think too much, nodded, and said, "Then you can send my concubine off on my behalf." After sending Aunt Shui away, Mrs. Wang moved to Rongqing Hall, and found that Mrs. Xing had also arrived. Before she could salute, Grandmother Jia greeted her, "You came at the right time. I sent someone to ask. The second sister of the Yu family is about to give birth, and Brother Yi will send someone to pick up Mr. Zhen at that time. I asked him to let us know by the way, and I will not go. You two can go on my behalf and congratulate him." Mrs. Wang was stunned. She had just sent Aunt Shui away, but she didn't expect Grandmother Jia to come again. Before she could say anything, Mrs. Xing said hurriedly, "Hey, don't worry, old lady. I will definitely go." Mrs. Wang hesitated for a moment and hurriedly said, "I won't go. It's okay if the eldest master is at home. But now that the master is not at home, it's better to be more cautious." "Stupid!" Jia Mu shouted. "What's wrong with not being at home? Don't you stop moving around when you are not at home? Who would suspect you of anything? Since I asked you to go, if the second son has any dissatisfaction when he comes back, just ask him to come to me." This, Mrs. Wang was in a dilemma. Mrs. Xing smiled and said, "Since the second wife doesn't want to go, why should the old lady force it? Don't you still have me? We are a family, and the meaning is conveyed. If it doesn't work, ask the second room to prepare the gift and I will take it to her." Mrs. Wang was worried about being spied on, and Mrs. Xing was also worried about it. So, she was happy to go alone. Mrs. Wang was overjoyed and quickly agreed, "Yes. Yes. Yes. No," Jia's mother said without question. "It's settled. You go together." First, Zhang Yuni was deeply in love with Ying Chun, and Yuan Chun had already lost the opportunity. How could Jia's mother allow Wang Furen to be passive and lazy? Let the first house monopolize this favor. Second, Jia's mother was also worried that Jia Shi and Xing Furen had some little calculations, and letting Wang Furen go together was also a check and balance. In front of Wang Furen, even if Xing Furen had some little thoughts, it was not easy to reveal them. Of course, she didn't let Wang Furen go alone, and she also had this idea. In addition to worrying about deliberately leaving the first house aside and letting Zhang Yuni know, it would cause trouble, she also suspected that Jia Zheng had some instructions to Wang Furen. So she was also worried that she was secretly making trouble and disrupting Yuan Chuan's marriage. So she called Xingferin together, just to let the two of them check and balance each other. After all, it was a normal exchange of favors. Jia's mother would not question it, and Wang Furen could not refuse. She had no choice but to agree, since the old lady said so. I will do as she says. Mrs. Wang had lived in the hot spring villa for some time, and knew the layout of the villa. She thought to herself that if she went alone, they could live at the two ends of the courtyard, so the risk of exposure would not be too great. But if there was another Aunt Shui, the three of them would live in the same courtyard, which would undoubtedly greatly increase the risk of exposure. After returning, she thought about it, and was still worried about being exposed. Not only did she not invite Aunt Shui to go with her, but she kept the matter secret. Chapter 408 Sisters-in-Law. March 20th. Noon. Two carriages galloped in front of the hot spring villa. Zhang Yuni clasped his hands together, raised them above his head, and said to Zhenshirine, who got off the carriage first, "Thank you for your hard work. It's my duty. Take me over to see the situation." Zhenshirine jumped off the carriage and followed Zhang Yuni into the villa quickly. Jin Chuan, who got off the last carriage, followed closely behind. Zhang Yuni welcomed Zhenshirine into the room next to the delivery room, and then shouted to the outside, "Midwife! Call a midwife to come out and tell the master what's going on inside." "Master, I have tried my best, but the concubine has taken the initiative to come to the door." But the lady made all kinds of excuses, saying that the second master is not at home and is worried about the melon field and plum, so it is inconvenient to come. While Zhenshirine was asking the midwife Yusha about the situation in the room, Jin Chuan came to Zhang Yuni and reported to Mrs. Wang. She had served Lady Wang for many years, and the last two sentences imitated Lady Wang's tone, which was very lifelike. Zhang Yuni was a little surprised when he heard this, because he followed Jin Chuan's suggestion. Lady Jia sent someone to ask, so he followed the trend and promised that when Yusha was about to give birth, he would notify Rongfu so that Aunt Shui could take a ride with Lady Wang. Unexpectedly, there would be a problem. He exhaled a breath of turbid air, nodded, pointed to the house and said, "I know. Let's talk about these later. Go in and help take care of them first." Jin Chuan agreed and was about to go in, but she saw Lady Xing and Lady Wang coming together. Why is she here again?" Surprised, she quickly explained, "Master, what I said is absolutely true." Zhang Yuni looked back, waved his hand, and said calmly, "See the time later. If you have time, you will go back with Mr. Zhen. Remember to tell Auntie that she came here. Go in and help." After giving Jin Chuan a brief lecture, he turned around and looked at the two ladies, Xing and Wang, who had come rushing over. Although he roughly guessed Mrs. Wang's concerns, it was an indisputable fact that she had asked her to pass on a message to the Shui family last year. But there had been no news. Even if she was not intentionally obstructing him, she was at least passive and lazy, and naturally did not want the Shui family to follow her lead. Now that the plan had come to this, it was useless to regret it, and he could only make up for it. At the moment, the most urgent task was to destroy the relationship between Aunt Shui and Mrs. Wang. As for Aunt Shui, he was not worried at all. It's only half a year before the review of the Imperial Merchants. Right now, she thinks that Madame Wang can count on her. When she no longer trusts Madame Wang, is she afraid that she won't go into her pocket? Humph. It's true that the county magistrate is not as good as the current one. The two ladies have worked tirelessly. I will remember this favor. It's better to block both ends than to destroy the relationship between the Shui family and Madame Wang, and at the same time, block Madame Wang from pleading for the Shui family. Therefore, he took advantage of the topic and put on this attitude to block Madame Wang's mouth in advance, so that she wouldn't rely on their friendship. Madame Wang didn't expect that he actually remembered such a small matter. Just as she was about to explain, Madame Xing glanced at Madame Wang and said with a smile, "They are all used to a life of luxury. How many of them are willing to endure the hardship of this bumpy journey? If it weren't for the old lady's death order, the second wife wouldn't have wanted to come." Although she didn't know that Madame Wang was also Zhang Yuni's private goods, the first and second wives had always been at odds with each other. She deliberately tried to deceive Madame Wang and deliberately followed Zhang Yuni's words, changing Madame Wang's avoidance of suspicion to fear of hardship. When Mrs. Wang heard this, she was immediately anxious and was about to explain. Zhang Yuni waved his hand and said, "Mr. Zhen should have asked almost everything. Please forgive me for not being polite enough." After that, He ignored the two and walked into the room next to the delivery room. Jinchurin stood up and said, "Don't worry, Uni. I just asked the midwife. Everything is going well. It's just for this moment." Before he could finish his words, a crying sound came from next door. Zhang Yui bowed to Jinchurin and turned around to leave. "Congratulations, sir. Congratulations, sir. It's a little master." Zhang Yui strode into the delivery room. Aunt Wu was holding the baby in the cradle and came to him like offering a treasure. He glanced at his son, pretended to push Wu Ma away, then came to the bedside, took Yusher into his arms, and said, "Thank you for your hard work." Yusher glanced at Yuerji in the room and said, "It's not hard. It's hard for my second sister to accompany me to play for so long." Although she said this, she turned her head eagerly to look at her son in Wu Ma's arms. Zhang Yuni quickly winked at Wu Ma, stretched out his hand to hold his son in his arms, and moved closer to Yusher. Comforted, "Don't worry. I have always remembered what I promised you. Now the preparations are almost done. After the mourning period, it will be legitimate. The first child cannot be raised by her side, but must be registered under Yuerji's name. Yusher is most worried about the child and her future status. The reason why she deliberately mentioned Yuerji at this time is that she hopes she will treat her son well in the future." Hearing this, she couldn't help crying with joy. Really? Master won't make it difficult, right?" She said she was in trouble, but she even changed her address. Zhang Yudi patted Yosher's shoulder and said, "Don't worry. I'll take care of everything." As she was talking, a message came from outside. "Master, the two ladies are coming in to visit Auntie." Although Yusher knew that Mrs. Xing had been caught, she didn't know Mrs. Wang yet. When she heard that it was the two ladies, she was a little flustered and struggled to get up. But Zhang Yuni held her shoulder and whispered a few words in her ear. Yosher's face suddenly became interesting. From shock to surprise, he handed the child to Wu Ma and told her, "Take the child out and let the two ladies see him. And then take some silver and give it as a reward." After Wu Ma left, he said, "Now, there is no need to consider them. I also have a way to deal with the old lady. You just wait patiently." Although no one in the Jia family would be so blind, Yusher was a widowed sister-in-law after all, and he was in mourning, so it was inevitable that people would talk about him. So, there was no need to be so anxious. Hey, Yusher put her head close to his chest, and then struggled to push him and said, "Master, you can't leave me alone. Go and greet the two ladies." Yusher only knew one thing, but not the other, and didn't know that Zhang Yuni had full initiative. Thinking that she would need the help of Mrs. Xing and Mrs. Wang in the future, she tried to let Zhang Yuni earn more favors. Zhang Yuni hesitated for a while, then half reluctantly stood up and said, "Then I'll go first." After leaving the door, Mrs. Xing and Mrs. Wang immediately came to greet him. Mrs. Xing said first, "It's not good to have too many people inside. I'd better go and see Zhen. Zhen's daughter-in-law's sister? It's good that you've shown your intention." He deliberately looked at the sky and said, "It's getting late. If it's any later, we won't be able to return to the city. Let me take the two ladies away." "I'm not in a hurry to leave," Mrs. Xing said hurriedly. "When I came here, the master told me that he had something to discuss with you." She thought that it was inconvenient for Mrs. Wang to be present. Seeing this, Mrs. Wang also hurriedly said, "Since we came together, we can't leave separately, so I'll accompany my sister-in-law." Although she was also worried that Mrs. Xing would see something she shouldn't see. Zhang Yuni was obviously a little unhappy just now. It was obviously inappropriate to leave in a hurry before he could explain. Zhang Yuni didn't say anything, but nodded and said, "Then I'll take the two ladies away and go to the yard next door to rest." He took the lead and entered the yard next door, and the two hurriedly followed. After pushing open one of the guest rooms, he stood at the door and said, "Second madam, please stay in this room." Mrs. Wang looked at Mrs. Xing, who was always by her side, and could only bite the bullet, and said, "Sister-in-law is really biased. I definitely don't mean what she said. But, the master is not at home." Seeing Zhang Yuni's indifferent attitude, she couldn't help but worry that he believed what Mrs. Xing said. So she explained tactfully. Unexpectedly, Zhang Yuni tore open her long coat and said playfully, "What master? Tell me, who is the master?" The sudden move scared Mrs. Wang to death. She hurriedly looked at Mrs. Xing, but she didn't see any anger on her face, and she didn't mean to stop it at all, but was just stunned. Knowing what Mrs. Wang was worried about was one thing, and ruining a rare opportunity was another. Because she knew what Mrs. Wang was worried about, she simply did the opposite and whipped her hard, just as a small punishment. Therefore, he did not make any unnecessary moves towards Madame Xing. He pulled off the extra weight on Madame Wang's body and pressed her against the door frame, grinning and saying, "It is only natural for you to serve the master. Are you afraid of who will know?" Chapter 409, Dissociation. Because he was angry that Madame Wang had ruined his good deeds, Zhang Yuni kept venting his anger on her until he punished her so much that she was breathing out more than breathing in. And then he calmed down a little. However, although he had embarrassed Madame Wang and made her lose face in front of Madame Xing, he also made her eat a lot of fat. So it was hard to say whether it was a reward or a punishment. However, Zhang Yuni didn't care what she thought. Pa! When he finally vented his anger, he slapped her, put on Madame Xing's open inner garment, and said without question, "Since you are here, stay for a few more days. I will send someone to tell the old lady that you want to stay and soak in the hot spring." Madame Xing looked like a dead pig that was not afraid of boiling water, and Madame Wang nodded with despair. If she came alone without Grandmother Jia's nod, she would be worried that it would arouse suspicion. Now that he was traveling with Lady Xing, he no longer had this worry. The first and second houses had always been at odds, which was conducive to covering up for each other. It must be said that the harmony of Rongfu was maintained by him alone. Jiamu probably couldn't have expected that these two daughters-in-law, who had always been at odds with each other, and whom she hoped to check and balance each other, could actually live in harmony and support each other. Zhang Yuni didn't enjoy the bond between the sisters-in-law. Although he ordered Jin Chuan to go and stir up trouble, he didn't know whether Lady Wang had made any arrangements. Even if Jin Chuan went there without stopping as soon as she returned to the mansion, it would probably be dark. In order to prevent Lady Wang from making any arrangements in advance, she ordered her trusted maids and mothers to cover up her whereabouts on the grounds of rest, and simply kept her for a few more days so that Aunt Shui could go and verify it. In addition, this was also to set an example for Aunt Shui in advance. With Mrs. Wang's experience, her psychological barriers would be reduced a lot when she stayed overnight. At present, although she missed the opportunity, with the approaching Imperial Merchant Review, she would not be forced to abandon her concerns. After hugging Mrs. Xing out of Mrs. Wang's room, he took Mrs. Xing to the next room and said, "Don't let her know about Yosher's affairs." Since he knew that Mrs. Wang had selfish intentions, he had to be on guard. This was also the reason why he stopped Mrs. Xing from visiting before. Mrs. Xing was a little jealous at first, but after hearing this, she was immediately delighted and pressed her soft body against him like a sesame cake, saying, "Don't worry, Master. I won't have to worry." She then asked, "By the way, that old man asked me to come and ask what happened to the matter that Master entrusted to him last time." Zhang Yuni was stunned for a moment before he realized that she was talking about the exchange meeting. Since this exchange meeting was to cover up the truth, it was naturally impossible to introduce Jiaxi. He thought for a while and said, "Go back and tell him that the Zhongchuan king is either a cabinet elder or a duke, and at least a minister. The status of a general in Ronghua Mansion is really not enough. If he really has this idea, he might as well organize one himself." Firstly, although Jiaxi is a person who only takes in and never gives out, he is still a member of Ronghua Mansion after all. Organizing such a party will inevitably add a sum of money, which can be regarded as a disguised way of draining the finances of Ronghua Mansion. Secondly, it is to lay the foundation for Yuan Chun to be a concubine. Although he had already planned to make the matter a fait accompli and was confident that he could force Lady Jia to submit, he had to learn from the experience of Lady Wang this time. And it would be good to have an extra layer of protection. Organizing such a party is not a good idea. Once it is spread out, it will inevitably damage the reputation of Rong Mansion. In this way, he can also take Yuan Chun as a concubine, adding another reasonable excuse and bargaining chip. After explaining, he returned to the courtyard where Yusha was. Entering the house, Yusha hurriedly said, "Thank you for your hard work. Are you all appeased?" She just thought that everything Zhang Yuni did was to lay the groundwork for her status. "Well," Zhang Yuni nodded and said, "I'll let them stay for a few days. You should also pay attention to them. Let's keep it a secret from the second wife for now." He looked inside the house and saw only Yusanjia and Qingwen, two maids, Lu Wu, and couldn't help wondering, where is the second sister? Yusha smiled and said, "Qingshi went to accompany the second sister. She has suffered a lot recently. But now she has finally survived. The master will go to her place to see her later. Although she didn't suffer. In order to avoid getting pregnant when she was pregnant, she had less opportunities to serve. Now, there is no need to worry about this. Although she is still in confinement in name. It is only a month. At most, she can lie about premature birth and cover it up. Zhang Yuli nodded. Accompanied Yusher to dinner. And then moved to Yu Erji's room. He pushed the door and entered the room. His eyes lit up and saw Yu Erji lying naked on the bed. Qin Keqing, who was sitting at the head of the bed, saw him and hurriedly got up and grabbed a glass wine bottle on the bedside table. She poured the newly brewed red wine on Yu Erji. She stretched out her hand and stroked Yu Erji's body, put her wine-stained fingers into her mouth, raised her head, smiled charmingly at Zhang Yuni and said, Uncle, second aunt has been tired recently. Uncle must compensate her well. She now has a status, and usually calls Yu Erji and other sisters. Only when she helps Zhang Yuni with fun. She calls them back to their original names. Zhang Yuni leaned his back against the door and closed it. Yu Erji leaned her back against the bed, opened her arms, kicked her feet, and her back was suspended in the air. She stretched her body and opened her eyes to look at Zhang Yuni. Her charming face was full of eyes. Her mouth corners were raised. Her lips were slightly parted, and her bright red tongue tip poked out from her pearly teeth, hooking towards the wine stains splashed on the corners of her lips. At the same time, in the bathroom in the small courtyard in the northeast corner of Rongwa Mansion, the sound of water was thundering. Indistinctly, there was also a rapid panting sound. After a long time, a hearty sigh came out. Jean Chua Fong in the room withdrew her hand, walked around behind Aunt Shui, raised her hand and put it on Aunt Shui's shoulder, walked around along the mountains, and massaged Aunt Shui to relieve her fatigue. At the same time, she leaned close to her ear and said, Why didn't Aunt Shui go with Madame today? Otherwise, I could serve Aunt Shui in the warm soup now. And I wouldn't be so helpless like now. What? Aunt Shui suddenly opened her eyes, twisted her plump body into a twist, looked at Jean Chuan, and said in disbelief, Sister went today? That's right. Not only did she go, but when I left, Madame didn't leave yet. Most likely she will stay for a few days to take the opportunity to soak more. How could it be? Aunt Shui was skeptical. When I went there that day, she also told me. She said it was inconvenient to go over. Even if she changed her mind, she should have just told me. How could it be? Then I don't know. Jean Chuan lowered her eyebrows and eyes, looking at Aunt Shui who was in a mess in the bathtub, and said in a gentle and persuasive way, Logically speaking, Auntie has mentioned this matter. She can't have forgotten it. Right? Auntie, why don't you think about it carefully? Is there any other reason? I haven't seen her these few days, and there was nothing wrong that day. What could be the reason? Aunt Shui murmured to herself. No. No way. Although she said no, she was obviously not confident enough and felt a little guilty. Jean Chuan said exaggeratedly, Oh, how could the servant deceive Auntie? If Auntie doesn't believe it, go to Madame's room tomorrow morning and you will know. Seeing Jean Chuan's solemn promise, Aunt Shui also believed it for the most part. She couldn't help but think that recently Mrs. Wang had been urging Jia Baoyu and Shui Baochai to make a marriage contract in private. Chapter 410 Skirt Trial. Early in the morning of the next day, Jean Chuan did not rush to the small courtyard in the northeast corner to inquire about the news, but came to Heng Huayuan with a bundle. Aunt Shui's eagerness to inquire would easily arouse suspicion. She knew that Mrs. Wang and Aunt Shui had always been planning a golden marriage. And now there was a rift. It happened that the suspender skirt was already ready, so she took the opportunity to send it to add fuel to the fire on Shui Baochai's side. It can't be said that she was an accomplice to the tiger. In order to please Zhang Yuni, she worked hard on both sides of the Shui family. After all, the accomplice is the guide who buried in the tiger's mouth. And she was saved by Zhang Yuni to save her life. Because she rushed early, when she arrived at Heng Huayuan, Shui Baochai had just got up. Jean Chuan did not wait outside, but went straight to the inner room, raised the bundle in her hand to her chest, and said with a smile, Miss, just try it on. If there is anything that does not fit, I can take it back and modify it. As she said this, she came to the bed and said, Let me do it. Baochai glanced at the bundle in Jean Chuan's hand, turned to Inger and said, You go down first. After Inger left, Jean Chuan opened the bundle, revealing 2 suspender skirts made of cloud brocade inside. Holding 2 suspenders, she showed, "Cloud brocade is smooth. I specially picked this material for you. It is not only comfortable to wear, but also very breathable. It is just right to wear at this time of year." She deliberately emphasized the cloud brocade, came in front of Xue Baochai, and turned it over and over. Although Jin Chuan claimed that she had chosen the material, how could she give such precious material as Yunjin to a maid as a favor? This undoubtedly confirmed her previous guess, and she thought to herself, it was indeed Brother Yi who borrowed the maid's hand. She was excited, and her blood was boiling. Looking at the half-covered suspender skirt in front of her, her face turned red. Xue Baochai was thinking about what Zhang Yuni meant by giving her such a shameful little dress. Jin Chuan urged, "Miss, this nightgown is worn next to the body when sleeping. You have to take off all these before trying it." Xue Baochai was stunned when she heard it. But Jin Chuan had already taken it. She did not refuse, but said calmly, "Isn't it too little to cover? Look at what you said. Is it less than the belly band? Besides, the belly band is easy to be off when you fall asleep at night and turn over. It is better to have this one on all sides, so you don't have to worry about turning over." But Xue Baochai pointed to the inverted triangle in front of her, which was empty, and she was hesitant to speak. "Hey, miss, you worry too much. This is for sleeping. Who can see it? It's natural to wear it when it's cool. To be honest, no one wants to wear it again after wearing it." She quickly untied Baochai's restraints, put the suspender skirt on her head, clapped her hands and said, "Miss, what do you think? It must be said that this suspender skirt only has 2 strings hanging on the shoulders, unlike the belly band neck, which has several strings tied behind the back. In addition, it is made of material like brocade, so it is indeed much more comfortable to wear than her usual belly band." Baochai couldn't help but look down and saw a large piece of snow-white breasts exposed, and her heart rose to her throat. Although Jin Chuan kept saying that this skirt was worn when sleeping, outsiders didn't know. But since it was made by Zhang Yuni, wouldn't it be? She was hesitant, but she said, "You are right. Since it is worn when sleeping, outsiders cannot know it. So the more comfortable it is, the better." As if she felt that she was trying to cover up the truth, she pulled the hem of the skirt that barely covered her buttocks and hesitated. "But, is it too short?" Jin Chuan's eyes lit up when she heard this, and she hurriedly said, "If you think it is too short, I will take it back and make 2 more for you. You should try them all on first to see if they fit you." Baochai pondered for a moment, shook her head and said, "Forget it. This brocade is very precious, so don't waste it." "Don't. What's this little bit of material? Since it's my intention, I have to modify it until the lady is satisfied. Brother Yi's intentions are not bad." Baochai secretly complained in her heart. How could such material be allowed to be used freely by the maid? Zhang Yuni must have specially instructed that she must be satisfied. Thinking of this, she became more and more excited, and the blush on her face became more and more difficult to hide. However, despite this, brocade is precious after all, and Baochai does not want to leave a picky impression on Zhang Yuni, and the previous refusal is just a pretense. Therefore, she said firmly, "You just said that. Anyway, it's for sleeping, so it's not a problem if it's shorter." Jin Chuan was a little disappointed after hearing this, and tried to persuade her a few more times, but seeing that Baochai had made up her mind, she had to give up. She tried another one on Baochai, took off the suspender skirt, and helped Baochai put on her clothes. Just as she was about to fold the skirt, she saw Baochai walk to the cabinet, grab the skirt in her hand, and rub it for a while. Seeing this, Jin Chuan was eager to try again and said, "Miss, is there anything wrong?" But Baochai shook her head and said, "There is nothing wrong with this skirt, but the lace of the suspenders is too rough. If it can be replaced with a finer and flatter one, it will be more comfortable to wear. Then I will take it back." Baochai waved her hand without waiting for Jin Chuan to finish, and said thoughtfully, "No need to take it back. Inger is the best at making lace. Ask her to make more and send them to the mansion later, so that we can keep them for future use." After all, Baochai also managed the family business. After accepting Zhang Yuni's kindness, she wanted to return the favor. Jin Chuan naturally understood the meaning of the words and said with a smile, "Thank you very much, young lady. I am clumsy. Although Qingwen is good at sewing, she is just average at making lace. I have heard that Sister Inger is very good at making lace. This really helps a lot. Balchai smiled and said, It's just a few laces. How can it be so exaggerated as you say? That's right. My skills are average. I can make 2 sets of this. The outer garment is very complicated. I am worried about wasting the good material. So I beg you to ask the Inner Court Weaving Bureau for help. I am afraid it will take some time to deliver it. Originally, this kind of thing can be handed over to Qingwen, and there is no need to send it to the Inner Court. But the last time she asked Qingwen to mend it, she became suspicious. Jean Chuan was worried that she would find out the trick. And she also had selfish motives, and didn't want Qingwen to share the credit. Coincidentally, Zhang Yuni didn't want Qingwen to find out what he was doing behind his back. So he went with the flow. Although she kept saying that she was begging Zhang Yuni, it was obvious that she was trying to cover up her mistake. In addition, Balchai had already seen the whole picture, and could tell there was a problem with the ingredients. She was even more convinced that it was Zhang Yuni who had instructed her. But she pretended to complain. Why didn't you discuss it with me in advance? Wouldn't this cause trouble for Brother Yi? What's the trouble? Jean Chuan said sarcastically. Miss, don't you think about who the master is? It's just a matter of a word. And even the material has been paid for by the Inner Palace. As she was talking, Inger's voice came from outside. Miss, Madam has sent someone to invite you over. Balchai felt a little embarrassed when she heard this. Jean Chuan smiled and said, The nightgown has been tried on. Since the aunt is looking for you, I won't bother you anymore. It takes 2 to clap. Jean Chuan knew very well that the golden marriage was a tacit understanding between Mrs. Wang and Aunt Shui. Now, Aunt Shui happened to come to find Shui Baochai at this time. Calculating the time, I'm afraid she has already gone to Mrs. Wang's room to verify it. Chapter 411 Sisters Have Dissension. Baochai and Inger sent Jean Chuan to the gate of Henghuayuan before parting ways with her. When they arrived at the Shui family's courtyard in the northeast corner, they saw Aunt Shui leaning back on the Kong with her clothes half open. Sighing, she winked at Inger, then went into the room alone, sat down on the Kong and said, Could it be that my brother has caused trouble again? Why is mother so worried? Alas, Aunt Shui sighed and said, I just went to your aunt's place, and the maid said that Jenner's daughter-in-law's sister gave birth yesterday, and she went to Ear's farm outside the city. Ah? Baochai asked in confusion. Such a good opportunity. Why didn't mother go? Who said it wasn't? Aunt Shui complained and told everything about greeting Mrs. Wang in advance. Because she was guilty. She didn't want Baochai to know that Jean Chuan served her meticulously. So she kept her words to herself. At the end, she said, What do you think your aunt means? Isn't she unhappy with us for pushing back the marriage? At this point, she looked at Baochai and said, How about? No. After hearing what Aunt Shui said, Baochai was thinking about Mrs. Wang's intentions, and she couldn't help but exclaimed. Perhaps she felt that she was too eager. So she hurriedly explained. Aunt said it nicely to reassure us. But in fact, this marriage contract seems fair. But it is a layer of bondage. Why? Aunt Shui asked hurriedly. Baochai asked back. Mom, don't you think about it? If you really want to reassure us, why do you have to hide it, and hide it from the old lady? Isn't this, the old lady likes Lin Girl, and your aunt is worried that she will not agree. That's right, Baochai said with a gloomy face. If there are repetitions in the future, aunt can use this as an excuse to put all the blame on the old lady. On the contrary, we are in a stronger situation than people. Even if we hold the engagement, it is just a piece of waste paper. But why did she do this? Aunt Shui was really puzzled. She was not like Baochai. After all, she was a widow and a generation older. Although Jean Chuan had ill intentions, it was inconvenient for her to tell her master's intentions. She could only conceal her true intentions and wait until Aunt Shui let down her guard so that she would be caught off guard and half-hearted. What Baochai said was right. The situation was stronger than people. Not to mention that their family was living under someone else's roof. Just look at Zhang Yuni's attitude towards Rongwa Mansion. Mrs. Wang liked this marriage, and there was no need to do these little tricks. So, she suspected that it was because of the previous hesitation that made Mrs. Wang unhappy. So she deliberately left herself behind. But Baochai didn't think so. With Jean Chuan's clear suggestion, she didn't need to pin her hopes on Mrs. Wang. However, after all, there was a private transaction. Even if it was Aunt Shui, she was embarrassed to tell the truth. She had to say in a roundabout way, at the beginning. Uncle and Aunt kept saying that my elder sister was going to marry into the palace. This was originally decided by us earlier, so we have to be on guard. She took a deep breath and continued, and now my aunt didn't help with the family affairs at all. If we make a private engagement with her again, it would be tantamount to giving someone a handle. When the time comes, she will hold the engagement in her left hand and threaten us with my brother's affairs in her right hand. But it will be too late to regret it. Aunt Shui couldn't help but feel scared when she heard this. If she hadn't doubted Mrs. Wang's intentions before Jin Chuan told her. Now, knowing that Mrs. Wang intended to leave her out, and having heard Bao Chai's analysis, she had to suspect that she had bad intentions and was deliberately delaying. The more she thought about it, the more she felt that something was wrong. If not, Yuan Shun and Zhang Yuni's marriage would have been a hot topic long ago. With this relationship, why would they be so reluctant about such a small matter? In order to avoid getting close to Zhang Yuni, she even lied and deliberately prevented her from going to congratulate. However, despite this, the Shui family was weak after all, and the Imperial Merchant Review was imminent, so she had no choice. She could only pin her hopes on Bao Chai and hurriedly asked, "Then what do you think we should do?" Bao Chai felt a little entangled when she heard this. It was difficult for her to speak out her guesses and Zhang Yuni's hints, not saying it would not be enough to appease Aunt Shui's worries. While hesitating, she suddenly came up with a plan and said with a smile, "Last time Jin Chuan gave a mirror to my daughter. She said she also gave one to my mother. Brother Yi is a very generous person. In my opinion, he may not remember those little things. We just need to bypass my aunt and go directly to him. He may not be unwilling to help." Although Bao Chai was confident, and Shui was not without concerns, she said worriedly, "Although your method is good, if your aunt knew that we bypassed her and secretly went to find Brother Yi, it might be counterproductive." Bao Chai pondered for a moment and said, "Mother, don't worry. Leave this matter to your daughter, and I promise that the news will not be leaked." How could Aunt Shui not worry? She asked hurriedly, "I am so nervous. How can I be at ease? Tell me quickly." Bao Chai lay on the table, leaned close to Aunt Shui, and said in a low voice, "This is not difficult. Mom, have you forgotten? When Jin Chuan was driven out of the house by Aunt, she wanted to die. If it weren't for Brother Yi's rescue, she would have lost her life. I don't believe that she has no grudges in her heart. Let's ask her to pass a message to Brother Yi. Even if she doesn't want to help, she will definitely not tell Aunt." Although she was very sure in her heart, in order to avoid Aunt Shui's suspicion, she couldn't swear. But these words woke her up. Because Bao Chai didn't say it clearly, Aunt Shui couldn't help but worry that her daughter's weight was not enough. Thinking of Jin Chuan's close relationship with her, she said, "You are right. When she comes to my place next time, I will first test her attitude." Bao Chai was stunned when she heard this. And then she said with joy, "Why? Jin Chuan often comes to mother's place? She hasn't come many times." Aunt Shui was guilty and blurted out. When she reacted, she quickly changed the subject and said, "But you are right. Not only did they send me a mirror last time, but now I also have a share of fruits. If Igor still remembers the original incident, he would not send it to me." She deliberately said this to cover up. But to Shui Bao Chai's ears, it was undoubtedly a mother's status based on her daughter, and she was more convinced that Zhang Yuni was interested in her. Thinking of this, she felt relieved and said, "In that case, when she sends something next time, Mother will test her attitude." At that moment, the mother and daughter discussed the words again, and Bao Chai took her back to Henwu Garden. Although she agreed to Aunt Shui's indirect approach, it was just a temporary measure to appease her. She was sitting on the Kong, thinking about how to respond so that Zhang Yuni would understand her feelings. Suddenly, a scream came from the inner room. She was startled. Then her expression froze, and she hurriedly got up and rushed into the inner room. Sure enough, Inger blushed and was grabbing the suspender skirt that Jin Chuan had brought her. Seeing Bao Chai rushing into the room, Inger murmured like a child who had made a mistake, Miss, this couldn't have been pulled down by Jin Chuan just now." This close-fitting little dress was very embarrassing, and she couldn't help but think of the last time Jin Chuan took away Bao Chai's clothes. In a wealthy family, it is not uncommon for a fake phoenix to be fake. However, Bao Chai has not yet married. If such a thing is spread, how can she get married? So, she deliberately said that it was pulled down by Jin Chuan. Bao Chai frowned upon hearing this, and was silent for a long while before she heaved a sigh of relief and said, "This is what Brother Yi asked her to send." Inger was immediately shocked and looked at her young lady in a daze. But Bao Chai said calmly, "It's enough for you to know about this matter. I have something else for you to do." "Miss, think twice," Inger exclaimed, obviously thinking wrongly. "What are you thinking about?" Bao Chai shouted. "I have agreed with Jean Chuan that you should make some lace for Brother E. You can go there when you are free these days. Make a few at random. When Brother E comes back, find a chance to ask him what color he wants." Inger, as a personal maid, naturally couldn't hide her clothes from her. So it was better to tell her openly to prevent her from having wild thoughts and causing trouble. In addition, she was an unmarried girl after all, and it was inconvenient for her to personally do many things, so she had to leave them to Inger. After that, she patiently gave instructions for a long time, no matter how big or small. Inger nodded like a chick eating rice, while raising her eyes to secretly look at Shui Baochai's expression. Chapter 412, an opportunity that comes to your door. Dangxian Pavilion. First floor hall. Inger rubbed the gold thread in her hand and made a brocade, and said casually, "Why hasn't Sister Jean Chuan come to our place recently? Master Jin and Madam are still here, and I have to take care of my brother here. So how can I run away all day long?" Knowing that Aunt Shui was anxious to find Bao Chai, Jean Chuan was not anxious anymore. It just so happened that there was no fruit to be delivered on the farm during this period, so it was a good opportunity to leave Aunt Shui alone first. However, while Aunt Shui was temporarily left alone, Shui Baochai was not idle either. Although she did not go to Rongwa Mansion, Inger came over from time to time to make brocade. Jean Chuan understood what she meant. Not only did she not mention Baochai's previous words that she had made it and sent it over, but she also used the excuse that the materials were all in Dangxian Pavilion, so as to avoid the inconvenience of finding materials temporarily, and directly brought her here. Inger nodded and asked, "Have you changed the brocade I made last time for my son? The lady said that it's secondary for us to wear it, but the child can't be hurt. How can I not change it?" Jean Chuan said with a smile, "Thanks to Miss Bao for thinking it through. I actually neglected it. When Master comes back, I must tell him to thank you." Inger was delighted when she heard this. As Bao Chai's personal maid, she naturally had to go along with the dowry. Seeing her master's intentions, it would not hurt to win her favor in advance. Thinking of Bao Chai's instructions, she followed Jean Chuan's words and said, "By the way, my son has been born for more than half a month. Madam and Miss have been talking about my son's full moon wine. Master Yi and the others will be back soon. Right?" Speaking of the devil appears. As soon as she finished speaking, Zhang Yuni walked in from the door. "Master Yi." Inge got up quickly. Jean Chuan also wondered, "Hey, what happened to Master?" "Oh, I have to go to Prince Zhongxuan's mansion tonight, and come back to change clothes." Jean Kiching had too many tricks, and pouring red wine on her body that night was just one of them. Zhang Yuni was so happy that he almost forgot about the arrangements of the Shui family. He was too lazy to go back to the city. He went to the Immortal Academy to answer questions for the teachers during the day, and went back to kill time at night. He originally planned to stay until Yosher's confinement was over, but unexpectedly, Prince Zhongxuan sent someone to tell him to go to the mansion to keep an appointment in the evening. So he came back to change into casual clothes. He was afraid that Jean Chuan would ask too many questions. So he came to Inger, looked at the string in her hand, and changed the subject. "What are you doing?" Jean Chuan quickly exaggerated Bao Chai's proposal and praised, "Thanks to Miss Bao's carefulness. There are so many of us, but none of us thinks as well as she does." She turned to Inger and said, "By the way, didn't you say you wanted to ask what color and pattern the master needs? It happens that the master is back, so you can ask him. I'll go see my brother first." After that, she turned around and left. Inger was stunned, then pursed her lips, stole a glance at Zhang Yuni, and trembled. "What color and pattern do you like?" "Sir?" Zhang Yuni sat down on the stool beside the table and said, "Don't stand and talk. Sit down." Inger shook her head and said, "How can I sit in front of you?" "Sir? I'd better stand." Zhang Yuni didn't force it, and smiled. "Then tell me, what are they?" "One stick of incense, a stool facing the sky, like an eye block, a square wind, a chain, a willow leaf, and a heart-shaped plum blossom. It depends on what you like." She hesitated for a moment and added, "You can like anything, but the color matching is a bit particular. It needs to be matched according to the color of the fan." "Purse, handkerchief." "Handkerchief." Zhang Yuni was stunned. He thought this thing was too sissy and had never used it. However, although he had never used it, he knew that the handkerchief was a belt tied close to the body. It was extremely bold for her, a girl's personal maid, to discuss such a close-fitting item in front of a man from outside. Thinking of this, the look he gave Inger also changed. Although Zhang Yuni had also given his own lady close-fitting clothes through Jin Chuan. Jin Chuan was still a girl after all. Inger seemed to think it was a bit too much, and hurriedly said, "Pine flowers go with peach red, and bright red must be matched with black threads, or stone blue can suppress the color. Master, just tell me the color of the handkerchief, and I will match it for you. I have never used a handkerchief." At this point, Zhang Yuni changed the subject and said, "But I do need your help to make a few threads for the waist." "Ah?" Inger was confused. Zhang Yuni changed the subject and asked, "How old are you this year?" 16 years old. "You are so clever and skillful. I'm sure Sister Baochai can't leave you. She will definitely take you with her when she gets married." Hearing this, Inger's cheeks flushed slightly, and the thread in her hand was already in a mess. She secretly glanced at Zhang Yuni, then hurriedly lowered her eyelids and said in a trembling voice, I can only make a few threads. How can the lady not leave me? Ha ha ha. A sentimental lady shares a mandarin duck bed. How can I bear to let you make the bed?" This was an extremely explicit statement. Although Inger didn't know that this was what Zhang Sheng said to Heng Yang in the Romance of the West Chamber, she understood the meaning of the statement. She was not surprised but happy, and looked at Zhang Yuni shyly. Zhang Yuni saw this and said with a smile, "I often play with Jin Chuan. I wonder who will be lucky tomorrow to enjoy the two of you." The master and the servant. Inger smiled as if offering a treasure. "Master, you don't know that our girl has several advantages that no one else in the world has. And her appearance is secondary." Jin Chuan had said this before. But Zhang Yuni asked knowingly, "What advantages? Tell me in detail." Inger took 2 steps towards Zhang Yuni and whispered, "The young lady is cold on the outside and warm on the inside. Warm in winter and cool in summer. And she has a strange fragrance on her body." Speaking of this, she glanced at the door and continued, "Sister Jin Chuan has a similar figure to the young lady. The young lady often gives her some old clothes. I heard from Sister Jin Chuan that the master likes that smell the most. Oh, Zhang Yuni has a faint fragrance of her own, which he has a deep understanding of. This cold on the outside and warm on the inside, warm in winter and cool in summer, is another surprise." Zhang Yuni smiled evilly, and Inger was confused. He said quickly, "Master, please don't tell Miss that I said it." "Of course." Zhang Yuni smiled and stood up and said, "Master, I am in a hurry today and can't wait for Jin Chuan to change my clothes. You accompany me upstairs and change into casual clothes. By the way, show me how to match the color of the waistband." After saying that, he went upstairs without waiting for Inger to agree. Inger hesitated for a moment, lowered her head, and quickly followed. Zhang Yuni was not the kind of person who would ask for clothes and food. Although he was used to being served, he still knew where to put clothes. He took out a set of casual clothes from the cabinet and opened his arms. Inger hesitated for a moment, blushing, and undressed him. After taking off the outer garment, he turned around and put away the official uniform. Turning back, he saw that Zhang Yuni had already taken off his inner garment, and the middle door was wide open. "Ah!" she screamed, and before she could take a closer look, she hurriedly raised her hands to cover her eyes. After covering her eyes tightly, she realized that something seemed wrong, secretly opened her eyes, peeked through her fingers, and hurriedly put down her palms with an embarrassed look. "Master," looking at the underwear that Zhang Yuni put on, which looked like neither underwear nor skirt, Inger smiled awkwardly and said, "Master, you are really creative." Zhang Yuni seemed not to notice her actions, and grabbed the waistband and tore a slit. When the 2 ends of the belt were shrunk, he held the 2 ends of the belt and said with a smile, "Come and help Master. What color should be matched with this?" Inger glanced at the slit above the waistband and said with hesitation, I know what color it is." "How can that be?" Zhang Yuni stepped forward quickly, grabbed Inger's hand, pulled it to the knot, and said with a smile, "This cord is worn inside. If you don't come and touch it carefully, how can you know what pattern to weave so that it won't be tight?" Chapter 413 Storms and Clouds. She is indeed a clever girl. After half an hour, Zhang Yuni smacked his lips, pulled his belt, tied a knot, and said with a smile, "Don't worry, I won't treat you badly in the future. I didn't accept you today because I was worried that you would get hurt and have difficulty walking, which would give people a clue. When Inger heard this, her eyes, which were choked with tears, showed a hint of joy. Puffing her lips, she muttered, "Thank you. Thank you, Master, for your pity." Zhang Yuni raised his hand and pinched her puffed cheeks, then wiped the corner of her lips calmly, and smiled. "Go rinse your mouth, wash your hands, and come to help Master put on your clothes." Since Inger took the initiative to lead the topic to the lower body, how could Zhang Yuni miss this opportunity that came to his door? However, family members know their own affairs. He knew that once he used Inger, even if he could hide it from others, he could not hide it from Shui Baochai. However, he did not want to give up this opportunity to plant spies in the Shui family. So he changed his mind and tried it in a different way, and took Inger for his own use first. It's not that he had to act like a master and couldn't dress himself, but for a maid like Inger. The more he did this, the more he seemed to regard her as his own. When Inger came back happily after washing, he opened his arms. When he put on his inner and outer garments and moved to the front to button them, Zhang Yuni put his arms around Inger's slender waist and pressed her against him like a sesame bun. He pursued her up and down, rubbing her ears and temples. When Inger was panting, he said, "If Sister Baochai asks you, you can tell her directly. If she doesn't ask, you don't have to tell her. Do you understand?" Although Inger's previous words were probably instructed by Baochai, she was ahead of her master and took the initiative. Not to mention that Baochai would not expect it. She would probably not allow it. This is also the reason why he went with the flow. Sure enough, Inger felt relieved after hearing this. She hesitated in his arms for a few times, and then followed the topic and said coquettishly, "I dare not tell the young lady." Zhang Yuni patted her back and said without comment, "I will remember your merits. I will reward you when the time comes." Although as Baochai's personal maid, it is a foregone conclusion that she will be a concubine in the future. But even so, there is a difference. With Shi Shangyun's pearl and jade in front, with the family status of the Shui family, even if she is not a concubine, she must keep her tail between her legs and look at Zhang Yuni's face. And Zhang Yuni is obviously not a waste like Jiao Lian. A maid who doesn't want to be a concubine is not a good maid. And Xiangling, a former maid of the Shui family, set a good example and was able to take the initiative to please him in advance. So Inger would naturally not refuse. After comforting Inger and getting dressed, he left the Dangxian pavilion and came to the pavilion on the mountain. He briefly explained a few words to Jin Chuan, then came to the front yard, got on the carriage, and rushed to the Zhongshuan palace. He was led into the side hall, but he saw Zhongshuan, Gu Dasho and others with serious expressions. Before he could greet them, Gu Dasho took the lead and said, "Young friend Yuni came at the right time." He briefly told the story, looked at Zhang Yuni with a serious face and said, "At first, it was just the use of bird droppings that caused the disease. But now, it has spread far and wide. The gentry in Jiangnan are all shouting that it is the bird droppings that are causing the harm. I am afraid that it can't be covered up. Young friend, think about it quickly. Can you get yourself out of it?" Zhang Yuni frowned and asked instead, although he sent people to the south before the new year, Mei Lian went there to take charge after the opening of the court. Even if he hurried, it would be at least early February before he arrived in Jiangnan. How could there be a large-scale disaster? Besides, 3 crops have been planted around the capital, and they are all fine. Why is it that only Jiangnan has problems? He frowned not because he was worried about himself. This large-scale disaster could only be caused by the smuggled bird droppings that were not processed. However, Jiangnan is the granary of the Great Xia dynasty. Once it is affected by the disaster, I am afraid that the people will be displaced again. How could we not understand this? But the public opinion is strong. And now there are complaints in Jiangnan. Plus there have been complaints about the emperor's obsession with Taoism. I am afraid that someone will take advantage of this and bite you to death. When he said the second half of the sentence, Gu Dasho lowered his voice and shook his head and said, "This matter is also my fault. I misjudged the person." Zhongshuan Wang took over the conversation and said, "The old man received the news that Mei Lian not only did not defend himself, but instead instigated the gentry in Jiangnan to jointly write a letter to accuse you of bringing disaster to the country. The people, I am afraid that it will take at least a month, at least half a month, for the memorial of the people to be sent to the emperor." Qi Yuandao, Duke of Qing, said in a deep voice, Other things are fine. But the most feared is that it will provoke a civil uprising. If it gets out of control, it will not be a joke. Zhou Xianzu, the Minister of Personnel, said, His Highness asked me to bring a message to Yun Yi. He trusts you. But this matter is serious, and we have to find a way to explain it to His Majesty as soon as possible. Zhang Yunyi nodded, and then said, By the way, why didn't Li Taiwei come? Last time, the only person missing from the gathering was Li Conwen, the Minister of War. Zhang Yunyi could not help but make some guesses. As for Mei Lian, he did not even mention him. After all, he was irrelevant. When he recommended him, he also had ulterior motives. In fact, digging a pit also reduced the psychological burden. When Zhang Yunyi asked this question, everyone was silent. As the host, King Zhongshuan could only bite the bullet and explain, he has something to do today and said he can't come. Although King Zhongshuan said it tactfully, Zhang Yunyi understood it. After all, he has no foundation, and he is not as good as these people present. I am afraid that Li Conwen has already received the news and deliberately declined. He bowed to the people present and said, Thank you for your reminder. He smiled and said calmly, The bigger the storm, the more expensive the fish. When the enemy comes, the general will stop it. And when the water comes, the earth will cover it. There is nothing to worry about. Don't be careless, my friend, Gu Dasho advised. Zhang Yunyi explained calmly. If they only wanted to get involved with the bird droppings, I might have to be more cautious. But if they dragged it to the emperor, they would be courting death. The mourning period for my cheap father has not yet passed. How could Zhang Yunyi forget how he died? When he said this, Gu Dasho's eyes lit up. My friend, you mean, a smart person doesn't need to make things clear? Zhang Yunyi nodded and said, Prince Ning must be anxious to distance himself from the matter, and is happy to draw the fire to me. Since they have to make things uncomfortable, why don't we lend them a hand and add fuel to the fire? After all, he also plotted against the emperor. If the king of Qin hadn't asked Zhou Xianzu to bring him a message, he wouldn't have said this. But now, he hopes to take the opportunity to increase his weight in the heart of the king of Qin. When he said this, the eyes of the others suddenly lit up. Zhang Yunyi took the opportunity to say, I have no one to use. I am afraid I have to trouble you to help. People have a herd mentality, especially when the crowd is excited. They are most likely to be led astray. To give an inappropriate example, someone in the community grows vegetables and destroys the green belt, and the owners are excited and ask the property management to deal with it. At this time, as long as someone shouts that the property management does not take action, it is easy for people to forget their original intention and turn to attack the property management. Zhang Yunyi wants to take advantage of this. However, this matter is serious. Although he is not without someone to use, there is no one who can talk to the joint letter. He must rely on the connections of the king of Qin and Gu Dasho, which is one of the reasons why he said the above words. To be honest, the bird droppings need to be exposed to the sun for a month before they are properly treated. Those who sell bird droppings must have only cared about making money and could not wait to properly dispose of them before selling them, which led to the disaster. If the cause of the bird droppings itself cannot be ruled out, it is very likely to bring disaster upon oneself. In addition to the above arrangements, we must also increase the confidence of the king of Qin and others. Good. Good. Gu Dasho clapped his hands and said with a smile, It's rare that my friend actually has such a plan. When the emperor is furious, then expose their private sale of bird droppings. I'm afraid the emperor will have to suspect that they are deliberately putting the blame on the emperor. Now we just need to hold our troops in place and start a fire in Jiangnan first. When the memorial is presented to the emperor, I will be summoned for questioning, and I will add fuel to the fire. At this point, Zhang Yunyi changed the subject and said, However, the disaster relief work cannot be delayed, so as not to cause a big mess. At that moment, the few people discussed the details carefully again, and talked until 3 o'clock in the morning before leaving the Zhongshuan Palace. Chapter 414 Waves. Strategically despise the enemy. Tactically take the enemy seriously. Although Zhang Yunyi acted confident and calm in the Zhongshuan Palace, it was impossible to say that he was not worried at all. After all, if the matter got out of hand, the emperor might not consider the overall situation and push him out as a scapegoat to calm the public anger. Therefore, in addition to the arrangements made by the king of Qin and others, he also needed to make some preparations. Fortunately, He got the news in advance and knew the whole story, and even knew where the key point of the problem was. Regardless of whether the main contradiction can be directed to the emperor's cultivation, the most important thing is to make the emperor believe that the statements of the immortals before him are indeed credible. Guano has been questioned, and white sugar and glass are not shocking enough. After thinking about it, only the iron ship and iron horse can make the emperor shocked. Fortunately, when the emperor knew that he was going to celebrate the Wansho festival, he made 2 preparations, and the research and development of the steam engine had already yielded results. Originally, he was planning to wait for some improvements before launching it, but now he had to rush it. Due to time constraints, he only had time to add 2 simple carriages to make a simple old steam train to deal with it first. As for the iron ship, it depends on the situation. Although it is just a model and does not need to consider durability, it may not be in time. Therefore, it is only a backup option to add icing on the cake. He even has a better idea, considering whether to make an iron cylinder that can float and dive to serve as a simple submarine. In this way, as long as the memorial from Jiangnan is presented to the emperor before it is delivered to the capital, it will probably be foolproof. Because he had to command at Tiangong Academy, he had to temporarily put aside the teaching of immortal studies. He did not return to the hot spring villa outside the city, but only sent someone to send a letter outside the city. He did not say a word about what happened in Jiangnan. First, if something really happened, the children of the family would not be able to escape even if they wanted to. Second, how can eggs remain intact when the nest is overturned? In ancient times, even in times of peace, there were bandits and road bullies. Running around was dangerous. On the contrary, if he really got into trouble, the emperor and the king of Qin might still remember their old friendship and take care of him. While Zhang Yuni was preparing to deal with it, Mei Lian in Jiangnan was not idle either. A garden was packed with people, because he was ambitious. After more than 10 days of communication, he had summoned many gentry and Confucian scholars to discuss the details of the joint letter. Mei Hanlin is upright and has a good reputation. He is also an imperial envoy of the inner court. It is most appropriate for you to write a letter. What virtue and ability do I have? Mei Lian said with a proud expression, raising his hand to stroke his beard. All the local sages are highly respected, and most of them are from famous families. There are also seniors who have retired to their hometowns. Why should you be so modest? After all, we are victims. But you are here on orders, and you are an official of the Tiangong Academy. It is selfless for you to write a letter. That's right. What kind of person is he who would rather break than bend? It's a pity that Zhang the thief is unworthy of being a son. The bird droppings he made harm the people. And he also used sugar and glass to please the emperor and compete with the people for profits. Your Excellency dares to make direct criticisms, which is really a model for the court. Then I will be disrespectful, Mei Lian said with a smile. Suddenly, someone in the crowd shouted, Your Excellency is so righteous. That thief Zhang used magic to deceive the emperor. If you can correct the chaos and persuade the emperor not to indulge in it and harm the country, you will be remembered in history. Yes. 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 As soon as these words came out, they immediately attracted a lot of echoes. The emperor is obsessed with cultivating immortals, and has not been involved in state affairs for more than 10 years. As scholars, if we cannot speak out and make direct suggestions, wouldn't it be a waste of all the years of reading the books of sages? I have heard for a long time that Mei Hanlin is upright and never associates with those scoundrels. Several prestigious gentry standing in the front row looked at each other and looked ugly when they saw the excitement of the crowd below. They said in unison, No. Why not? As the saying goes, the upper class follows the lower class. If we cannot correct the chaos from the root, there will be Li Yuni even if there is no Zhang Yuni. That's right. You were bewitched by that thief Zhang before, and now you are deeply harmed by bird droppings. Are you still unwilling to turn back? That's right. Are you trying to excuse Zhang the thief? The effect of this bird droppings has been verified, so naturally it should be used by our own people first. However, the spread of the disease has led to the spread of the people and expanded the impact. Now that the Hanlin scholar has raised his arm and called for action, we, the scholars in Jiangnan, will only follow your lead. Why should we worry about not accomplishing great things? Come here. Bring me paper and pen. Seeing such a big commotion, Mei Lian couldn't help but get angry and said in a loud voice, Since you all trust me, I will risk my life to make direct criticism even if my blood is splattered 5 steps away. The law does not punish the masses. We are willing to sign with the Lord, and will not let the Lord bear the responsibility alone. Mei Lian has not been in Jiangnan for long, and he can only talk about it. He is not clear about the smuggling of guano by the wealthy families in Jiangnan. The gentry in the front row, although worried, are more worried about the smuggling of guano being exposed. Seeing the huge momentum, they feel that the law does not punish the masses. So they bite the bullet and sign the memorial. In less than a month, his joint memorial spread throughout the Jiangnan area. For a while, there were many people who came to see the scenery. That day, a large number of students gathered in front of the Zhejiang Provincial Education Office and rushed into the office. Upon hearing the news, Jia Zheng hurried to the front of the hall, without waiting for him to appease them. The leading student said righteously, "Sir, now that the students in Jiangnan have united their will, Mei Hanlin has already submitted a petition. As the academic commissioner, you should do your part." "That's right. You are from the Ronghua mansion. How can you sit back and do nothing after the founding of the country? The academic commissioner has the duty of educating people. How can you just stay out of it now?" "That's right. I heard that the villain Zhang Yuni is the junior of the academic commissioner. If you come forward, it will not only add momentum, but also be more convincing. Your Excellency can kill your relatives for the sake of justice. You will definitely be remembered in history and passed down as a good story." Jia Zheng was originally a little embarrassed, but when he heard everyone talking about it, he was moved. "Please listen to me." He took a deep breath, raised his hands, pressed them down, and said confidently, "I have read many books of sages. How could I turn a blind eye to it? To be honest, when I was in the capital, I had some complaints about such strange and lewd skills. That's why I asked the emperor to send him out of the capital. Out of sight, out of mind. Now that the general trend is here, how could I turn a blind eye to it? Long before you came here, the memorial had been set out. Your Excellency is so noble and upright that the students really admire you. Okay, go back and wait for good news." After sending away a group of students, Jia Zheng hurried back to the back hall, took out the memorial, wrote it quickly, and sent someone to send it to the capital. He thought to himself that Zhang Yuni would definitely not be spared if such a commotion had occurred. In this case, he would not be spared. However, if the students forced the emperor to abdicate, it would be better to lie and claim that they had already submitted a memorial. Chapter 415, Act with Caution. "Master, the other day, I set peaches over, and the concubine tried to test me. Why not strike while the iron is hot, and take the opportunity of the full moon banquet? Why change it to a 100-day banquet?" Recently, Zhang Yuni has not been outside the city. There is only one maid, Jin Chuan, in the mansion, except for occasionally staying at Wang Shifeng's place. She is mostly served by Jin Chuan, which makes her feel very satisfied. She didn't know that the storm was coming outside. She just thought it was Zhang Yuni's reward for her, and she became more and more concerned. Zhang Yuni took 2 mouthfuls of porridge and said casually, "I have to finish the confinement before I can come back. Otherwise they will be caught in the wind on the way and miss the full moon banquet." Which is not good. Now it is a time of trouble. He doesn't want to make trouble. And he is thinking that after 100 days, things should be settled. Because the full moon banquet for boys is usually held 1 day earlier and 1 day later for girls. Zhang Yuni changed it to a 100-day banquet on the grounds that Yosher's confinement was not completed. As he was talking, he suddenly heard someone outside reporting, Master Shirong is here. What is he doing here? Did he hear something?" Zhang Yuni thought so in his heart, waved his hand and said, "I know. Let him wait in front." Suspecting that Jia Rong had heard something, he deliberately left him out. This kid is a poisonous snake. The more times like this, the more you need to be on guard, lest he thinks there is an opportunity to take advantage of it and bite back. After finishing breakfast slowly, he moved to the front hall. Uncle E, seeing Jia Rong nodding and bowing, with a smile on his face, Zhang Yuni could not see anything unusual. So he joked, "It's strange today. Why did you get up so early? Didn't you go out to fool around last night?" Jia Rong said flatteringly, "Uncle E knows my nephew well. I did fool around last night." At this point, he changed the subject and said, "However, I have always kept Uncle Yi's instructions in mind. I dare not delay for a moment. I didn't dare to close my eyes all night last night, and came to report to Uncle E early in the morning. What happened? Zhang Yuni asked in confusion. Uncle E? Have you forgotten? You told me to keep an eye on Uncle Shui. Yesterday, I was drinking with him outside. I heard that something happened in his shop. Thanks to Uncle Yi's face, Shantian Prefecture let him off. Zhang Yuni was stunned when he heard this. He cursed in his heart, but said calmly, Tell me, what happened? I heard that Shui's shop sold fake ginseng, and someone found out on the spot and reported it to Shantian Prefecture. No one died. That's not the case. But 2 fake ginsengs were found in the shop, and several others lost their medicinal properties, which confirmed the charges. Okay, I get it. You keep an eye on me. He didn't expect that the Shui family would actually sell fake ginseng. He couldn't help but feel lucky that he didn't have too deep an entanglement with the Shui family. If it were normal times, and nothing serious happened, he wouldn't mind using this as a threat to force the Shui family to surrender. Now is a time of trouble, and we cannot afford to lose the big picture because of the small. He got on the carriage, gave Sierra an order, and headed straight to Shantian Prefecture. Shantian Prefecture Governor Li Mingyuan came out from the hall and bowed, saying, Master Zhang, what brings you here? Master Li is too polite. Zhang Yuni bowed slightly and got straight to the point. I heard that the prefecture has recently received a case of fake ginseng? Li Mingyuan smiled and said, It's just a piece of cake. Why do you have to come here in person? Zhang Yuni didn't argue and said directly, Ginseng is a life-saving thing. It's about human life. So you should be cautious? This? Li Mingyuan didn't expect that he would flatter the horse's leg. He asked in confusion, Doesn't the Shui family have some relationship with you? Friendship is friendship, and duty is duty. We are deeply favored by the emperor. How can we be partial to the law? I also heard about this matter, and came to ask you to deal with it impartially. Although he didn't say hello. But when the wall falls, everyone pushes it. And when the drum is broken, everyone beats it. It's hard to guarantee that someone won't take advantage of the situation. It's better to be cautious. Li Mingyuan was confused for a while, and tried to probe. This matter is quite strange. I heard that the Shui family is an imperial merchant. I think they don't lack this little money. It may not be that the clerk is deceiving the superiors and the subordinates. Why don't we catch the clerk and ask him first? Li Mingyuan's words are not unreasonable. The Shui family was originally a royal merchant, although it was a bit exaggerated. They cut off the caustic soda business, but added 2 income items: white sugar and glass. They were not so foolish as to be interested in the small profits of selling fake ginseng. If it was really that the clerk deceived his superiors and subordinates, he really couldn't wrongly accuse the good people. Zhang Yuni nodded and said, Well, remember to handle it impartially, and don't give people a chance to talk. After leaving Shatian Mansion, he came to Tiango Injuan. Still a little worried, he asked Sierra to call Zhang Dehui over. He roughly told the matter again and urged, You go and ask the shopkeeper who is familiar with the Shui family about the situation of the fake ginseng. Although the words were said bluntly enough, there was no guarantee that Shantian Mansion would not make some false confessions to please him. As an old man of the Shui family, it was more convenient for Zhang Dehui to inquire about these things. And he could also verify with Shantian Mansion to avoid listening to one side and believing it, so as not to let people catch the handle. After the arrangements were completed, Gu Wenhui walked into the duty room. He closed the door and whispered, Sir, His Highness sent a message that the memorial from Jiangnan will arrive in Beijing in a few days, and we will also proceed with the next plan. It was also Mei Lian who was too smart, because he planned to increase momentum. The memorial was not sent to the capital at a high speed, but was paraded through the city, escorted by a group of top students. It was half a month later than Gu Dasho's original estimate, which gave Zhang Yuni enough time to prepare. However, the time was still a bit rushed. The iron ship was not completed yet, but the simple train was completed for some time, and even a batch of rails were cast, because he was worried that the emperor's enthusiasm was over. Zhang Yuni had been forbearing and waited until the memorial arrived in Beijing. Okay, everything is arranged, and this official will go to the palace to see the emperor tomorrow. Mei Lian made such a big fuss, and naturally Zhang Yuni was not the only one who got wind of it. Inside the Ministry of Personnel, Jia Yuzun frowned. When he finally got home from the court, he went to Jiaoxing's room. Don't go to the old couple's place recently. Jiaoxing felt relieved when she heard this. Xiangling and other female relatives were all at the farm outside the city. Zhang Yuni was alone and stayed in the mansion. He had to go see his son when he went home. So it was inevitable that they would bump into each other. Although Zhang Yuni had not done anything radical, Jia Xing had a preconceived idea after all, and she would inevitably feel uncomfortable every time she bumped into him. However, Jia Yutsuan's sudden change surprised her, and she wondered, did something happen? Jia Yutsuan did not hide it from her, and told her about the impeachment in Jiangnan. Jia Xing was shocked and said, Then should I tell my sister? No. Jia Yutsuan hurriedly stopped her. He thought for a moment and added, My dear brother and the elder are close friends. How could there be no news? As the saying goes, a gentleman does not stand under a dangerous wall. This matter is serious, and we can't help much. It's better to protect yourself. If something really happens, the two elders and your sister will not be left without anyone to take care of him. It can be regarded as repaying his original favor. Having been an official for many years, he is well versed in the way to seek good fortune and avoid danger. He doesn't mind helping if it doesn't affect himself. But if it really involves too much, he can't put himself in danger for the so-called friendship. He is just worried that Jia Xing will be confused due to her concern. So he stabilizes her temporarily. With this promise, Jia Xing didn't insist anymore. After all, Zhang Yuni is just an outsider with bad intentions to her. Chapter 416, Offering Treasures. West Garden of the Imperial City. Woo! White steam, mixed with black smoke, gushed out, accompanied by the sound of clang. Clang! The earth trembled, and the black steel beasts slowly started. One by one, the armored guards held the hilt of the sword and blocked in front of Emperor Zhengqing, as if facing a great enemy. The eunuchs such as Zhou Xiangui, who followed behind them, trembled in their calves and trembled with fear, seeing that the black steel beast turned in front of everyone. Turning like a dragon, Emperor Zhengqing pushed away the guards in front of him. With bright eyes and excited face, he clapped his hands and exclaimed, The method of the immortals is indeed mysterious. It can drive such a huge beast without cattle and horses. My dear minister, you have made great contributions. You have brought the method of the immortals to my great Xia. Why should I worry about my country being forever secure? Your Majesty, you are too kind. I have only learned a little bit. Quick! Tell this Iron Dragon to stop, and let me go up and take a look. Iron Dragon. Zhang Yuni laughed dumbly. But the space was limited. The rails were arranged into an oval, and there were 3 or 4 flat plates hanging behind the front of the car, which was a bit like a snake. He quickly accepted the order, put his left palm flat, poked his palm with his right index finger, and made a pause gesture towards the front of the car. Zhou Xiangui immediately stepped aside, away from the crowd, and shouted in a hoarse voice, Your Majesty has ordered that the Iron Dragon should stop immediately. Woo! Crack! Before he finished speaking, the whistle sounded along with the noise of metal friction, completely covering his voice. The wheels at the bottom of the front of the car were flying with sparks, and the guards hurriedly raised their shields, only to find that the Emperor was still standing in front of them. Fortunately, Zhang Yuni stepped in front of the Emperor, and the guards rushed forward. Zhang Yuni smiled and said, It's okay. These sparks are just for show. They are just some dust. Seeing the train slowly stop in front of him, Emperor Zhengqing looked at the guards, who were in a hurry with dissatisfaction, and shouted, Waste. Then, he looked at Zhang Yuni impatiently. Zhang Yuni hurriedly opened the door. Emperor Zhengqing hesitated for a moment, and stepped onto the front of the train. Zhang Yuni followed him on the train. Several operators in the front of the train knelt down and shouted long live. Emperor Zhengqing looked around in surprise, looked at Zhang Yuni and asked, How does this Iron Dragon move? Why is there a stove inside? Zhang Yuni shamelessly said, Your Majesty is the real Dragon Emperor, and the Iron Dragon must be driven by Your Majesty. Ha ha ha. Emperor Zhengqing laughed loudly, obviously enjoying his flattery. He said, My dear, how come you have learned the tricks of Shaogizi? Although Zhou Xiangui didn't finish what he said just now, his meaning couldn't be more obvious. He was just trying to please the Emperor by giving orders to the train. It has to be said that other things are fine, but when it comes to flattery, eunuchs are the best. Zhang Yuni was also inspired by Zhou Xiangui to say those words. However, he naturally couldn't admit that he was flattering. So he said confidently, Your Majesty was originally ordered by heaven, and I am just telling the truth. He changed the subject and said, Although this Iron Dragon is a dead object, I was ordered by the late emperor to make the iron dragon for the emperor to drive. Isn't it obeying the emperor's orders? Ha ha! Emperor Zhengqing laughed again, waved his hand, and said, "My dear, what you said is right." He straightened his face and continued to ask, "Tell me how to drive it." "Your Majesty, please look." Zhang Yuni pointed to the furnace and explained briefly. After hearing this, Emperor Zhengqing pondered for a moment and suddenly realized, so that's how it is. I have also had a furnace explode when I was refining elixirs. Could this be the method that the immortals learned from watching the immortals refining elixirs? Zhang Yuni didn't expect that Emperor Zhengqing would draw inferences from one example. After a slight hesitation, he said, "I don't know about this." The more conceited a person is, the more he believes in his own conclusions. Since Emperor Zhengqing has already made this guess, he will make more mistakes. He bowed to Emperor Zhengqing and said, "There is a lot of smoke here. Please move." After getting off the car, he came to the flatbed towed behind and said to Zhou Xiangui, "Please ask Unit Shou to take someone to weigh the bag." Then, he introduced to Emperor Zhengqing. This thing is driven by firepower. It is called a train in the fairy world. It does not need to rest like cattle and horses. It can carry tens of millions of loads and travel thousands of miles a day. It can transport soldiers, food, and baggage equipment. It's just that novelty is obviously flashy and impractical. And it must have practical value. Of course, given the conditions of the Great Xia dynasty, it is obviously not a simple matter to really lay a railway. Not to mention the construction difficulty of building roads and bridges. Just saying that in the ancient security environment, preventing the theft of railroad tracks is not a simple matter. Good. Good. Emperor Zhengqing said with a smile. "My dear minister, you have made great contributions this time. If you want any reward, just ask." "Your Majesty," Zhang Yuni said with embarrassment. "Your Majesty, I want to ask the emperor for a few days off." Emperor Zhengqing said in astonishment. "Is there something wrong at home?" No, no, Zhang Yuni explained. "I was eager to present this to the emperor. I have been working day and night recently. First, I am a little tired. Second, my concubine gave birth to a son, and I have not been able to take care of him." "Oh," Emperor Zhengqing laughed. "Have you held a full moon banquet?" "Your Majesty, because I have no time to spare. I didn't hold the full moon banquet. I plan to hold it on the 100th day." Emperor Zhengqing waved his hand and said, "Okay, since you don't want to ask for a reward, I will wait until the 100th day banquet to add a happy atmosphere to you." He turned to Zhou Xiangui and said, "Remember to remind me." "Yes, Your Majesty." "Thank you, Your Majesty." It's not that Zhang Yuni didn't want to ask for a reward, but he planned to save more chips for later. Mei Lian's memorial will be sent to Beijing in the next few days. There is still more than a month before the 100th day banquet. By then, the matter will be settled. If the emperor wants a reward, he will naturally not refuse it. After leaving the palace, he felt much more at ease. Before that, he took the opportunity to flatter the emperor and mentioned Emperor Xingxian in passing, in order to remind the emperor that he was ordered to assist the emperor by the resurrection of the previous emperor. When he returned home, he heard the servants report that Zhang Dehui had been waiting for a long time. When he came to the side hall, Zhang Dehui hurriedly stood up and said, "Boss, I have found out clearly." He told Zhang Yuni the whole story. A few months ago, An Shui handed over several ginsengs that had lost their medicinal properties to the store. Although she could not see that the ginseng had lost its medicinal properties, the shopkeepers and clerks could see it clearly. Originally, they might not dare to move this idea. But the upper beam is not straight, and the lower beam is crooked. Seeing that An Shui was passing off inferior products as good ones, they thought that she was relying on some relationship with Zhang Yuni, and had nothing to fear. So they also boldly made some fake ginsengs in private, deceiving the superiors and the subordinates, and filling their own pockets. Although Zhang Dehui did not find out where the ginseng came from, Zhang Yuni naturally thought of the ginseng that Jiamu had. This news was a big surprise for him. On the one hand, the ginseng came from Jiamu. If it could be implicated, it would be the best. Even if it could not, it could be used to sow discord between the two families. On the other hand, since Jiamu knew that the ginseng was problematic, she still sold it to the Shui family. Even if she still had some personal money, it was probably very limited. Of course, Although the clerk took the blame for the Xue family out of selfishness, it did not lead to an unmanageable situation. However, since he had such an opportunity to control the Xue family, he naturally did not want to miss it. At this moment, he was worried that Shuntian Prefecture would find out the situation and make a decision early. Seeing that it was almost time to leave the court, he planned to go to Shuntian Prefecture again tomorrow. Chapter 417, An Unexpected Harvest. Shuntian Prefecture. Li Mingyuan and other court officials packed up and were about to leave the court and go home. But a yamen runner rushed into the inner hall and shouted, "Sir! It's bad. What's going on?" "Sir!" Many students from Jiangnan gathered outside the city. They said they wanted to restore order and persuade the emperor. He finished speaking in a broken voice, and everyone's face changed drastically. They looked at each other and pondered for a long time. Li Mingyuan took the lead and said, "Go! Capture the head of the Xue family first." "Sir!" Several court officials looked at him in surprise, and they were hesitant to speak. Although the momentum outside the city was huge, the outcome was still uncertain. What's more, Zhang Yuni still had the favor of saving him, so such a decision was obviously inappropriate and too hasty. Li Mingyuan waited until the yamen runners were ordered to leave. Then he raised his hand and explained, "Please be patient. It's not that I am ungrateful. Yesterday, Lord Zhang came to visit and specifically told me to handle it impartially. He would not make a fuss about such a small matter. Now I think that he probably received the news in advance and did not want to give others a handle at this juncture." After he said this, the faces of the court officials were relieved. "Your Excellency is wise. Since Lord Zhang has made preparations, he will not be caught off guard, and we are relieved. But if Lord Zhang misunderstands, wouldn't it be?" Li Mingyuan pondered. "It doesn't matter. We are just pretending, bringing the person back first and entertaining him well in the yamen." He paused, and then said, "Although the case is clear, there is no need to rush to make a decision, so as not to cause trouble. It will not be too late to make a judgment after the storm has passed and the dust has settled. What do you think?" "I think Master Zhang should give a heads up in advance to avoid any misunderstandings. Of course, I will send someone to go there later and inform him of what happened outside the city." "That's great." Just like that, before Zhang Yuni went to Shutian Prefecture the next day. That night, he met the person sent by Li Mingyuan to tip him off. Although Li Mingyuan's arrangement was not without a wait-and-see element, it was also advisable that he could send someone to notify him at this time. In addition, his operation was in line with Zhang Yuni's calculations, so he was not dissatisfied. "Go! Thank your master for me." Whenever something important happened, he was calm. Although the matter was about to be resolved, he did everything as usual. As usual, he looked at his son and took Jin Chuan back to the house to rest. Knowing that the memorial had arrived outside the city, he estimated that the emperor would definitely summon him, so he was not in a hurry to go outside the city. In addition, Yusher had just finished her confinement, and was worried that the family would panic and cause postpartum depression, so she did not send anyone to pick up Qin Keqing and others. At noon, Zhou Xiangui came to summon them. "That Mei Lian is really abominable. He slandered the emperor. You have to be careful to deal with him." After hearing this, Zhang Yuni felt relieved. These eunuchs are the best at observing words and expressions. Since they are willing to leak the news to him, they must have some guesses. He nodded and stepped into the car. After entering the palace, he followed Zhou Xiangui all the way to the imperial study. As soon as he performed the ceremony, Emperor Zhengqing threw a pile of memorials in front of him. "Ahem. Take a look." Zhang Yuni was a little surprised and grabbed the memorials and read them one by one. Others' memorials were fine, but Jia Zhen actually followed suit, which was unexpected for him. It was no coincidence that these memorials were sent together, because Mei Lian intended to increase his influence, and naturally gathered together to attract followers. After reading them, he pretended to be puzzled and said, "Your Majesty, this is strange. Tell me about it." Mei Hanlin will be in Jiangnan for his post after the new year. Even if he rushes, it will be almost spring plowing when he arrives in Jiangnan. Moreover, if the problem is really caused by bird droppings, why is it only in Jiangnan? Although I am not in Jiangnan, I have also reviewed the accounts in the south. He argued with reason, from the handling of bird droppings to the suspicious accounts, and finally raised his head after talking for a long time. But he was surprised to find that Emperor Zhengqing seemed to have aged 10 years. "Ahem. Emperor Zhengqing slumped on the dragon throne, not commenting on Zhang Yuni's words, but asked, "Didn't you say that as long as I delve into the methods of the immortals, I will be blessed with merits? Why do I feel worse today?" Emperor Zhengqing has been taking elixirs for many years. He was very emotional yesterday and had little energy in the evening. Reading these memorials today only added fuel to the fire. Although Zhang Yuni didn't know the reason, he had already planned his response. Without thinking, he quickly prostrated himself on the ground and said, "Your Majesty, the way of heaven is to reduce the surplus and make up for the deficiency. Although I have done my best, when human power is limited, the power of one person is ultimately limited. It is for this reason that I opened the Immortal School, hoping to make up for the omissions made by those corrupt officials, lazy officials, and the parasites of the country. Your Majesty." Seeing that Emperor Zhengqing did not speak, he continued, "Since ancient times, except for the 3 sovereigns and 5 emperors, even the Qin Emperor and Han Wu, there have been no emperors who have been able to add merits and become immortals. The reason is that there are too few loyal ministers and too many treacherous ones. Please understand." "Who?" Cough, cough, cough. Emperor Zhengqing exhaled heavily, causing a few more coughs, and then said, "I know you are loyal and commendable. Get up quickly." "Thank you, Your Majesty." Zhang Yuni finally put down the stone in his heart, stood up, and secretly looked at Emperor Zhengqing. He took a deep breath and said angrily, "I want to see who gave them the courage to slander the monarch and slander loyal ministers. Send an order to let the Jinui arrest all the people and put them in the imperial prison to wait for their fate." Zhang Yuni hurriedly said, "Your Majesty's protection. I am grateful to you. But if you put people in prison just because of these memorials, I am afraid it will be difficult to convince the public. Please send someone to Jiangnan to find out the truth. Clear Your Majesty's name, and clear my grievances." If it was just to save himself, his goal would have been achieved, and there was no need to make trouble. But since he wanted to burn the fire on King Ning, he had to take the opportunity to dig deep into the inside story. These traitors should not be killed to serve as a warning to others. Seeing that Emperor Zhengqing was determined to kill, Zhang Yuni was reluctant, but he had to persuade him. Killing them is a small matter, but it will damage Your Majesty's health. Please take care of your health. Jiangnan has suffered serious disasters, and disaster relief is urgent. Please understand, the right to speak in this world is ultimately in the hands of scholars. If the Emperor really kills people, he will become a mortal enemy with scholars in the world in the future. Forget it." After hearing this, Emperor Zhengqing waved his hand helplessly. "Then who should be sent? In your opinion? Your Majesty, please understand. You should do your job. I know little about the affairs of the court. Your Majesty should discuss it with the elders. At this point, his work has been done, and the rest should be handed over to Gu Das-ho and others. I really didn't misjudge you. Go down." Emperor Zhengqing waved his hand. Zhang Yuni was about to leave the imperial study, but was stopped again. "Wait! You just said that the way of heaven is to take away the surplus and make up for the deficiency. I deeply agree with it. If I abdicate and become an emperor, will it be?" Zhang Yuni was stunned and did not dare to show any surprise. He put on a panicked look and knelt on the ground. "This matter is serious. I dare not make any rash comments." Emperor Zhengqing did not ask any more questions, but said weakly, "You are loyal and commendable, and I can't let you suffer in vain. Take Jia Zheng's memorial back. For your sake, I will pretend that I have not read this memorial. You can decide how to act. Go." "Yes, Your Majesty. I'll take my leave." Zhang Yuni was inspired by the words. He found Jia Zheng's memorial from the scattered memorials and put it in his arms. Chapter 418, Asking for Help. Rongqing Hall. Aunt Shue's eyes were filled with tears, and she said in a sobbing voice, "Old lady, you must save Wenlong." It was already night when Shui Pan was arrested. It was normal for him to stay out all night. At noon the next day, he and the servant still did not come back. Aunt Shui began to worry and sent people to look for him. Only then did she know that such a big incident had occurred in her store, and that someone had reported it to the government. Since there was a problem with the ginseng that Jia's mother had given her, the silver was fine, but the matter had to be settled with her. Jia's mother said indifferently, "What trouble has this child caused again?" After being suppressed for so many years, it was finally possible to catch Jia's mother's weakness. Mrs. Wang couldn't wait to interrupt and said, "This time it's not Wenlong who caused trouble. The ginseng that the old lady gave to her sister years ago lost its medicinal properties and was reported to the government. The old man is still the best. Jia's mother reacted in a moment of stunned time. Her face showed no trace of shame or embarrassment, but full of surprise. She then bit back and said, "How could there be a problem? Didn't you ask the concubine to take it back for testing? Could it be a mistake?" After hearing this, Mrs. Wang couldn't help but look at her sister. And Shui didn't tell her these words just now, and couldn't help but wonder if she deliberately put the responsibility on her head. And Shui also had a hard time. Grandmother Jia did say this. But how could she expect that Grandmother Jia's ginseng would have problems? She said incoherently, I'm naturally relieved about the old lady's ginseng. So why would I ask someone to check it? This ginseng is not a trivial matter. It's something that can save your life. I asked you to take it because I wanted to do some good deeds. How can we do such a thing that damages our virtue? Jiamu didn't agree with Aunt Shui's words. How could the shopkeeper not see the problem with the ginseng? I'm afraid that the Shui family was reluctant to spend the money and didn't dare to ask me to return it. So they sold inferior products as good ones. Old lady. Seeing that Jiamu seemed to be trying to distance herself from the matter, Aunt Shui was immediately panicked. Why panic? I didn't say I wouldn't help you with this. Jiamu still had some face. Mrs. Wang was suspicious, but she knew the problem of ginseng. What she said just now was just to distance herself from the matter. She changed the subject and said, however, we have a deal. I have reminded you of this matter. You can't blame me if you didn't test it. Yes. Yes. Aunt Shui responded repeatedly. Jiamu just asked, did anyone die? Damn? Aunt Shui was stunned and said hurriedly, no. Nothing happened. Jiamu felt relieved when she heard this, and ordered outside, Yuanyang, go to the East Mansion to see if Brother Yi is at home, and ask him to come over. Before that, Mrs. Wang brought Aunt Shui in, and sent the servants in the house away. Huh? Yuanyang agreed outside and left immediately. When she arrived at Ning Mansion and saw Jin Chuan, she said, is Master Yi at home? It's a coincidence, Jin Chuan said with some show-off. Master Yi was called into the palace by the emperor. Then when Master Yi comes back, please ask him to go to the old lady. Is there something? Jin Chuan asked with some doubt. Yuanyang murmured, I just took my wife and concubine to see the old lady. After talking in the room for a while, I was asked to come to see Master Yi. I guess there must be something important. Jin Chuan blinked and said, if that's the case, I'll accompany my sister to report to the old lady. Involving Aunt Shui, Jin Chuan couldn't help but be tempted. But Yuanyang's words were ambiguous, so she thought about asking. Arriving at Rongqing Hall, Jin Chuan took the opportunity to pay respects and carefully looked at Aunt Shui, and indeed saw tears in the corners of her eyes. So she asked, the master said last night that he would take a few days off, and this morning he was summoned to the palace by the emperor. I wonder if he will go directly to the farm outside the city. If the old lady has any urgent matters, I can send someone to ask there. Her words were purely for testing. But Aunt Shui got involved herself. Without waiting for Jiamu to speak, she interrupted and said, urgent? Why not? Wulong has been captured by Shentian Mansion for a night. How could this child have suffered such hardship? I don't know how he is doing in there now. While speaking, she also looked at Jin Chuan, her eyes full of worry. Jin Chuan was not surprised but happy to hear this. Originally, after hearing Yuanyang's words, she was still worried whether Aunt Shui would give in. But now she is full of confidence. As Xianling's maid, she has naturally heard Jiao Xing's flattery and Zhang Yuni's help at the spring plowing ceremony. She thought for a while and said, if it is really too late, I will ask someone to go outside the city to ask. If the master really went there, it is better for the concubine to go there and make things clear in person to avoid any omissions. Hey! Hey! Aunt Shui responded, like a chicken eating rice. Jiamu was happy to be free and smiled and said, you are still a thoughtful girl. Then we will wait for your news here. Hey, it's getting late, so I'll go first. After leaving Rongqing Hall, Jin Chuan took 2 steps at a time. If she planned to return to the mansion, she would send someone to the palace gate to send a message, and then trick Aunt Shui to the hot spring villa, and everything would be fine. Unexpectedly, when she arrived at the second gate of Rongwa Mansion, she saw Zhang Yuni walking in with a solemn face. Master, Jin Chuan hurriedly stepped forward and said, like offering a treasure. Something happened at the concubine's home, and she wants to see you. Before she finished speaking, Zhang Yuni raised his hand and interrupted her. No hurry. Let's talk about it later. Jin Chuan heard this and realized that Zhang Yuni's face was not good. She didn't dare to speak, and hurriedly followed him and returned to Rongqing Hall. No one died. What is there to worry about? It's just a matter of ears words. In Rongqing Hall, Jiamu and Mrs. Wang were comforting Aunt Shui, and in a blink of an eye they saw Zhang Yuni coming in. Jiamu hurriedly smiled and said, Speak of the devil. An ear is here at the right time. Before she finished speaking, Jiamu's face suddenly fell. Zhang Yuni suddenly took out a memorial from his arms, threw it at Jiamu without any courtesy, and said angrily, I have been very respectful to your family, but I didn't expect you to collude with outsiders to add insult to injury. If it weren't for the Emperor's trust, I'm afraid I would have been plotted against by you. This sudden scene shocked Wang Furen and Aunt Shui, and their hearts were in their throats. Jiamu was at a loss. What does it say? What does it say? Old lady, you should take a look at what it is first. Jiamu quickly grabbed the memorial, squinted her eyes, and looked at it carefully, and her face became worse and worse. When she saw the signature below, she exhaled heavily, suddenly threw the memorial at Wang Furen, and angrily scolded, Ungrateful things. Look at the good things you two have done. Mrs. Wang did not dare to dodge, and was hit on the face. She endured the burning on her cheeks, and opened it to take a closer look. After reading it, Mrs. Wang could not help but feel dazed. She cursed in her heart. Jia Zheng had broken his promise, offered her to him, and changed her job to a post outside the capital, but turned his face away from her, and secretly reported Zhang Yuni's mischief. If he was like this to Zhang Yuni, she would not let him off easily. Thinking of this, she retorted, what the old lady said? He isn't Jiangnan. Even if he impeached Brother Yi, what does it have to do with me? Since the couple had already torn their faces, they could not have a rift with Zhang Yuni for him. Jiamu knew that it had nothing to do with Mrs. Wang, but she had to put on a gesture to calm Zhang Yuni's anger. It was not that she knew she was in the wrong, but the situation was stronger than the person. Zhang Yuni could come to the mansion with a memorial and slap her in the face, which undoubtedly explained a lot of problems. Aunt Shui on the side was restless. He quickly stood up and said, You guys talk. I'm going to go back first. After that, without waiting for Jiamu and others to speak, he staggered out of Rongqing Hall. Chapter 419 Showdown. Aunt Shui was full of sorrow and trembling as she walked out of Rongqing Hall. Seeing Jin Chuan standing under the eaves, she immediately perked up and pulled Jin Chuan to the corner. You know, my sister is very defensive against me. This time, you must help me say something good. She was not worried that staying in Rongqing Hall would embarrass Lady Jia and Lady Wang. However, seeing that Zhang Yuni was so ruthless, it was obviously inappropriate to expect Lady Jia and Lady Wang to help intercede. Leaving early was, on the one hand, to sever ties, and on the other hand, to find another way. Madam, what you said is really embarrassing for me. Jin Chuan glanced at Yuanong and others standing at the door not far away, and smiled. This is not a place to talk. Why don't you follow me back to the mansion and wait for the master? Huh? Aunt Shui felt relieved when she heard this. She agreed and touched the bracelet on her wrist. However, she was too plump, and she was at a loss. So she was in a panic and failed to take off the bracelet several times. Jin Chuan saw it and stopped her with a smile. I can't bear it. Madam, you should keep it. Aunt Shui smiled a little embarrassedly. Find something slippery later. Jin Chuan did not comment, and turned to Yuanyang and Amber, who were guarding the door, and said, Please tell our master that I will go back to the mansion first. Yuanyang nodded awkwardly, with a trace of worry on her face, and unconsciously glanced in the direction of Rongqing Hall. But she didn't notice that Amber was looking at her with a frown on her face, although she and Jin Chuan and others had been guarding outside. Zhang Yuni did not lower his voice when he was in Rongqing Hall. She heard the words like adding insult to injury clearly. Originally, Yuan Chuan's marriage was widely spread, and she still hoped to be able to marry with Yuan Chun. Now, looking at the current situation, it is probably hopeless. Although the voices in the room have become lower now, and the conversation inside can no longer be heard. But Aunt Shui is in the room, and she must have seen the situation more clearly than her. If she had not followed Jin Chuan back, there might be room for maneuver. At this moment, she was eager to come out and leave Jia Mu and Wang Furen to wait in the East Mansion. It was undoubtedly a foregone conclusion, and Amber was also worried about this. She thought that Yuan An would marry with her, and she would be the only one in front of Jia Mu. But now it was undoubtedly ruined. However, they did not know that although Zhang Yuni in the room was still cold and stern, the situation was far less serious than they imagined. He knew the intention of the emperor to give him the memorial. The so-called not letting him suffer grievances for nothing more refers to the fact that he should be spared from the embarrassment when facing Jia Jing's backstabbing, and take the blame for the emperor's inconsistency, and resolve the rumors about Yuan Chun and Prince Ning. If the emperor just perfunctorily said that he could take Yuan Chun as a concubine last time, this time he made it clear that he could use this memorial to control Rongwa Mansion. However, despite this, the emperor was in the wrong first, and did not want to make a big deal. So he handed the memorial to him and let him handle it himself. So, after a temper tantrum and a gesture, seeing that Jia Mu apologized humbly again, he took the initiative and said, "Second, madam, go back first. I have something to say to the old lady, since he has the imperial sword." Of course, he has to confront Jia Mu. However, in front of Mrs. Wang, it was always difficult to say that Yuan Chun was a concubine. Mrs. Wang thought that he did not trust her, and hurriedly explained, "It is absolutely true. I really did not know anything about this. This bird droppings business also has my Wang family's contribution." "How could it be?" Zhang Yuni raised his hand, interrupted her, and glared at her. Jia Mu also said, "Listen to Brother Yi. You go down first." Mrs. Wang had no choice but to leave. After she left, Zhang Yuni said in a deep voice, "The old lady may not know yet. There are dozens of memorials sent to the palace together with this memorial. This damn fool. He is probably bewitched by someone. Brother Yi, please don't take it to heart. Whether I take it to heart or not is secondary. The emperor's side is the key." Zhang Yuni paused and continued, "It's okay to impeach me, but you should never, ever, point fingers at the emperor. It's really treasonous. Please help him say a few good words. If I hadn't excused him, how could the old lady see this memorial? Ahmed Ba." Jia Mu folded her hands. "Thank you so much, old lady. Don't be in a hurry to thank me." Zhang Yuni interrupted, "Although I have temporarily taken the memorial back, what will happen in the end depends on the attitude of the mansion." Jia Mu's heart was relieved, and she couldn't help but pick it up again, and asked hurriedly, "What does this mean? Repaying evil with kindness? How can I repay kindness? I have been sincere to the mansion, and I stabbed you in the back, and you still want to be my father-in-law. But it is no longer possible." This, Jia Mu's face froze when she heard this, and she said dejectedly, "Yes, I understand. Let's not talk about this marriage. Although the marriage does not need to be mentioned again, the emperor's order must be carried out." "Ah?" Jia Mu asked in confusion. "What does this mean?" Zhang Yuni asked back, "What does it mean? Old lady, don't you understand it?" He did not wait for Jia Mu's answer, and joked, "Why did the emperor let me marry the eldest girl? Isn't the old lady clear about the reason? But didn't you say?" At this point, the voice stopped abruptly. Zhang Yuni said with a smile, "If you don't want to be my wife, you can still be my concubine. As long as the eldest girl goes out, the previous rumors will be broken." He did not wait for Jia Mu to respond, and said to himself, "Of course, the emperor does not have to make the eldest girl my concubine to quell the gossip outside. He can directly question the mansion. At that time, whether the original rumors are true or not is no longer important. After all, how can a daughter of a guilty minister be worthy of being the concubine of King Ning?" He said these words with great force. Jia Mu felt her body soften when she heard them, and she collapsed on the Luohan bed powerlessly. Although she did not know that Zhang Yuni used the women in the mansion as his own metronome, but his attitude today was very different from the past. Although Jia Zhen stabbed her in the back first, he could use this as a threat to force Yuan Chun to be a concubine, which caught her by surprise. She didn't dare to blame the emperor, and pointed at Zhang Yuni tremblingly and said, You actually? Ha! Zhang Yuni sneered and said, "If it weren't for the fact that we are related, I wouldn't care about your life or death. Now there are only two options in the mansion. One is to do what I just said, and the other is to wait for the emperor to punish you." At this point, He cleared his throat and said, "When the time comes, some will be exiled. Some will be exiled. What will be the result? The old lady must think carefully. He already had enough chips, and no longer needed to pretend in front of Lady Jia. If she is not given a little color, she will probably not give in easily. I thought that this was enough. But unexpectedly, Lady Jia did not give in easily. Instead, she said, 'Are you really going to sit back and watch the second girl suffer?'" Zhang Yuni laughed dumbly, not knowing where Lady Jia got the confidence from. Could it be that he acted too well? So that the old lady knows that the eldest master has already sold the second girl to me as a concubine. "What?" Lady Jia exclaimed. Zhang Yuni said sarcastically, "The old lady just finished speaking. And then she changed her mind. I have to be on guard, lest you turn your face and deny it again. When you said that you wanted to let the eldest daughter replace the second daughter, I paid a sum of money to buy the second daughter and asked the eldest master to sign a document. I am afraid that you have no choice." "Evil creature." Jiamu trembled. How dare he? What the old lady said is true. Anyway, the second daughter will become a concubine. How can the eldest master refuse to receive more money? Jiamu leaned on the Luohan bed dejectedly. And then she forced herself to cheer up and said confidently, "Don't scare me with these words. I don't believe that the emperor can really confiscate your property based on this impeachment letter against you." "Ha ha." Zhang Yuni sneered. "The old lady can wait and see what happened to those people before making a decision. In fact, it is more convincing to bring up your own cheap father. But this would easily give others an advantage and make the emperor suspect that he was harboring resentment. Although he stopped the emperor from making the matter bigger, it was only for those students who got carried away, for those officials who wrote letters and pointed fingers at others. Given the character of Emperor Zhenqing, it is impossible for him to give them a light sentence. In addition, the king of Qin needs to direct the spearhead to the king of Ning. The smuggling of bird droppings and putting the blame on the emperor will inevitably be exposed. By then, it would be good enough if Emperor Zhenqing did not give a severe sentence. How could he make a big deal out of a small matter? Since Lady Jia is determined not to give up, she will wait for a while until she sees someone lose their head and their house is raided. By then, if they are as silent as a cicada and want to beg him again, it will not be as simple as taking a concubine. He calmly picked up the memorial on the table, shook it at Grandmother Jia and said, "I'll keep this memorial for now. When things are clear, we'll see whether to return it to the emperor." Grandmother Jia was a little flustered when she saw that he was confident, but she still didn't believe that the Rongwa mansion would be ruined by an impeachment memorial. So she swallowed her words. Chapter 420 Patient Persuasion. "Where are we going?" Aunt Shui followed Jean Chuan all the way to Huifang Garden, but she was confused when she saw that she did not lead her to Dangxian Pavilion. "Aunt, please be patient," Jean Chuan said with a smile. "You know, in this situation, I dare not bring you to the master without authorization. I have to test the master's attitude first." She had heard some noises at the gate of Rongqing Hall before, but Aunt Shui was eager to distance herself from the matter. So Jean Chuan easily found out about the things in Rongqing Hall. Of course, she did not want to find out what she said. It's just that although Madame Wang did not stay in Ning Mansion, Madame Xing was arranged by Zhang Yuni to stay in Linshui Pavilion every time she came. She couldn't help but guess Zhang Yuni's thoughts, and guessed that it was probably because of their different status that it was inconvenient to be open. In addition, because there were other people who were not doing it for the sake of it, they followed suit and simply brought Aunt Shui here. Aunt Shui left earlier than Mrs. Wang. Without any suspicion, she followed Jean Chuan into the Linshui Pavilion and thanked her profusely. "That's really troublesome to you." Then she complained, "It is said that relatives should protect each other. I don't know what's wrong with my brother-in-law. It would be fine if he didn't help. But why did he follow outsiders to make trouble?" Jean Chuan sneered. "I'm afraid he feels that he has suffered a loss and is unwilling to accept it." "What?" Aunt Shui was stunned. "Oh, nothing." Jean Chuan knew that she had said something wrong, and quickly changed the subject. "Aunt, you also know that in this situation, Master, let alone help, it's good enough that he doesn't hate the whole family. Now that Shui Pan has been arrested, there is no need to do anything extra. Just follow the original plan." So coax and threaten. Aunt Shui panicked when she heard this, and said desperately, "Please help me say something good. If Wulong can pass this test, I will be willing to lose everything." Jean Chuan glanced at her and said in a gentle way, Aunt, you are joking. Our master has always been affectionate and doesn't care about money the least. Yes. 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 I made a mistake. Aunt Shui complained. What's the big deal? Such a good relative. How can it be so serious? My brother-in-law is really out of tune. She was only blaming Jia Zheng at this moment, but forgot what she had done. Fortunately, Jean Chuan was still in the dark and did not mock her. She continued to persuade her, to be frank. The concubine and our master are not related. She just did it for the sake of the West Mansion. Now the second master over there is ungrateful, and even the other side is estranged. Let alone the concubine. I am insignificant, and my words are not taken seriously. Even if I want to help, I am afraid I can't do it. I know this is difficult to do. But since we get along well, you have to help say a few good words. Aunt Shui thought she was asking for a bribe, and quickly reached out to her wrist again. Unexpectedly, Jean Chuan grabbed him and said, to be honest, Madam, this is a big deal for you. But it is nothing to me. Madam, I'm afraid you don't know that last year, my godfather, who is also the governor of Shentian Prefecture, made a mistake during the spring plowing ceremony. The emperor almost punished the entire Shentian Prefecture. Although I was trying to help my brother-in-law, everyone in Shentian Prefecture remembered his kindness and came to visit him every New Year and festival. After hearing what she said, Aunt Shui immediately gained some confidence and sighed. It's a pity that Xiangling is not here. Otherwise, with the two of you helping to speak, we would have a better chance. Jean Chuan retorted, Madam, please forgive me for not agreeing with what you said. Why? Jean Chuan did not answer but asked, haven't you reminded Aunt this time? She did not wait for Aunt Shui to answer, and talked about it, whether it is aunt or maid. They are all the master's people, and it all depends on the master's will. As the saying goes, it is better to rely on yourself than on others, and you have to earn it yourself. Madam, why don't you think about it? Does what I said make sense? You are right. But you also said, what did Igor say? All are needed. So Aunt Shui regretted it so much. If she could have used business to build a solid relationship, why would she be in such a dilemma today? Just when she was at a loss. She heard Jean Chuan say, I can give you an idea. Aunt Shui was overjoyed and said, really? That's really. Don't thank me first. Aunt Shui, if I have offended you in any way, please don't blame me. How could it be? Aunt Shui vowed. You are helping me. No matter how foolish I am, I will not learn from my brother-in-law and not know what is good and what is bad. Then I am offended. Hey! Tell me! Aunt Shui looked at Jean Chuan eagerly. In fact, this matter is simple. It depends on how far the concubine can go for Master Shui. Jean Chuan emphasized the three words Master Shui and looked at Aunt Shui meaningfully, saying, although the master has no interest in money, he admires you, the concubine, very much. What? Aunt Shui exclaimed, staring at Jean Chuan blankly. Trembling. You. She wanted to turn hostile, but when she thought of Shui Pan who was in prison, she couldn't muster the courage to do so. Jean Chuan ignored her expression and continued, didn't Aunt Shui say last time that the imperial merchants would be reviewed at the end of the year? There will always be a time when favors are exhausted. Don't say that Aunt Shui doesn't have this favor. Even if she does, she will use it this time. But what about the next time? If Aunt Shui follows the master's wishes, she will be one of his own people in the future, so that it can be solved once and for all. How the master treats his own people, I don't need to say more. Aunt Shui might as well consider it. After hearing Jean Chuan's words, Aunt Shui couldn't help but recall her early speculations. She was torn between heaven and man, and her face turned pale. Jean Chuan didn't ask any more questions, and took out a suspender skirt from the cabinet. She turned around and came to Aunt Shui, saying, I am also an experienced person. I know that although the concubine is well-dressed and well-fed, she is very miserable in her heart. Now, I can not only prevent Master Shui from suffering, but also comfort him. Isn't it the best of both worlds? As she spoke, she stuffed the suspender skirt in her hand into Aunt Shui's arms. She usually took care of Aunt Shui's bath and measured her size. Considering her plump figure, she was afraid that someone would see the clues, so she secretly cut it in Linshui Pavilion. Originally, she was prepared for any eventuality and planned to wait until the 100 Days banquet to see if there was a chance to act according to the plan. Now, it just came in handy. Aunt Shui listened to Jean Chuan's miserable and comforting words, and thought of the absurd things she had done with her in the past. She felt her face burning, and her heart was panicking. It was not until Jean Chuan stuffed the suspender skirt into her arms that she realized something. Looking at the thin ropes hanging on both sides, she felt as if she was pricked by a needle, and was about to shake the skirt off her arms. But she heard Jean Chuan chuckle and said, "Madam, you haven't been tortured. Why are you like this? My mediocre skills are far inferior to yours. I'm sure you will appreciate it in the future. And you will have to thank me in the future." The word torture was like a heavy hammer, hitting Aunt Shui's heart, and her movements could not help but stagnate. Jean Chuan continued, "Madam, you don't have to tell me what you decide. You might as well think about it here. I'll go to the front and wait for you. If you think it through, put on this skirt. If you don't want to adopt my method, you can just leave directly." After that, she really turned around and left. But when she got to the door, she threatened, "But I have to remind you, madam, that if you leave this door, you don't have to come to me to find a way out. You should think of another way as soon as possible." Chapter 421. The concubine is offended. Alas, I wonder if Master Shui is still used to living in the prison of Shutian Prefecture. Jean Chuan closed the door and muttered to herself, then glanced at the closed room and walked out of Linshua's Ixuan. This muttering drifted into the room, and Aunt Shui couldn't help but shudder. If it was just selling inferior goods as good ones, and selling fake ginseng, as long as no one died, it would be possible to settle the matter by spending more money. But earlier, she suspected that Jia Zhen's death was strange, and she couldn't help but connect Shui Pan's arrest with the previous disputes. But Jean Chuan pointed out intentionally, or unintentionally, that Zhang Yuni's friendship with Shutian Prefecture made her more suspicious in this regard. In addition, Jia Yuxuan was the chief officer of Shui Pan's case. This case was a small one. If he caught this point and pursued it relentlessly, it would be really doomed. Because of this, she dared not act rashly in the face of Jean Chuan. You can avoid the first day, but you can't avoid the 15th. When she sent Xianling away, she had noticed Zhang Yuni's wolfish ambition. At that time, she was just suspicious, and he did not take any further action. As time passed, her worries gradually faded. Now, she has confirmed her original guess, and she can't help but feel mixed emotions, while secretly cursing Zhang Yuni for being petty, mean, and unscrupulous. She is also grateful. Fortunately, he still covets. Otherwise, she might face revenge like Jia Zhen, instead of the current coercion, inducement, and bargaining. Jean Chuan's words are not without reason. It's better to resolve the thief than to make him, especially since the Shui family is weak. As long as you grit your teeth, you can easily solve Shui Pan's case and the review of the Imperial Merchant, which can be said to be once and for all. Thinking of this, Aunt Shui felt a little more hot in her heart, and she swallowed dryly unconsciously. During this period, Jean Chuan's careful service from time to time did indeed arouse her long-buried thoughts. Although she was quite satisfied, it was ultimately empty talk and perfunctory. She was originally fat and afraid of heat, and the doors and windows in the house were closed tightly, airtight, and she thought of Jean Chuan's words that she was far inferior to the master, and she sweated like rain. In a short while, her clothes were wet, and they were wet and sticky on her body, and she felt that there was no place to enjoy them. Aunt Shui quickly took out a handkerchief and wiped the sweat from her neck. But the more she wiped, the more sweat she had. Finally, she turned her eyes to the suspender skirt that Jean Chuan handed over. She took a quick look and saw that it was the right size for her. Because she didn't know whether it was Zhang Yuni's intention, she couldn't help but worry whether she would be dissatisfied if she didn't change according to Jean Chuan's instructions. However, after all, she was still a concubine. How could she have the nerve to wear such a shameful dress just to please Zhang Yuni? In fact, she did not leave for a long time, and she had already made a decision in her heart. The only entanglement was whether to sit and wait for Zhang Yuni to come over and half push, or try to change into a suspender skirt according to his preferences. Now, she felt sticky and uncomfortable, and had an excuse to change. Aunt Shui hesitated for a moment, but finally raised her hand and pulled off the burden on her body. After putting on the suspender skirt, she felt a lot more comfortable, and she couldn't help but sincerely admire Zhang Yuni's ingenuity. But when she looked down and saw that touch of whiteness, she couldn't help blushing. She quickly raised her hand to grab the collar and pulled it up. and suddenly realized something, and her hands nervously grabbed the hem of the skirt again. However, she was only concerned about her head and not her, but, for a moment, she was in a dilemma and lost in thought. Suddenly, footsteps approached, and the door opened with a creak. Aunt Shui looked up suddenly and met Zhang Yuni's eyes, which were looking at her. There was fire in his eyes, and he wandered around her body unscrupulously. Wherever his eyes went, it seemed as if he was burned by a branding iron, which made Aunt Shui a little breathless and had to gasp for air, and the heat hit her hard again, and sweat came out uncontrollably. In this scene, Zhang Yuni felt his eyes brighten. The lotus-colored suspender skirt made a brocade-wrapped Aunt Shui's curvy figure to the fullest, especially the inverted triangle with the collar half open, which made the plump snow-white breasts ready to come out. And it seemed that the more she tried to cover up, the more obvious it was. Looking down, I saw that the hem of the skirt barely covered the buttocks. Although they were facing each other, I couldn't see the beautiful scenery behind them, but they revealed two straight and plump thighs, which were like snow-white jade pillars, tightly gathered together and fit perfectly. Although the body of a young girl in her 20s is like soft, it is still a little immature. How can it be compared with such a mature woman to quench thirst and satisfy hunger? Therefore, Zhang Yuni glanced at her, and couldn't help but feel his throat surging and his mouth drooling. His eyes wandered up and down Aunt Shui's body, and he accidentally saw a bean-sized sweat drop sliding down her white neck into the abyss. How could Zhang Yuni hold back? His throat moved, his voice hoarse, and he quickly stepped forward and said, "I'm sorry, Aunt." Puff. In the hot spring villa, Qin Keqing took a bite of the peel peach, not caring about the juice overflowing from the corners of her lips, and exclaimed, "TSK, TSK, TSK? This peach is juicy, sweet and delicious, and it really makes people never get tired of eating it." She stuck out her tongue to lick the juice spilling from the corner of her mouth, and looked at Yusher opposite with ill intentions, and said with a smile, "It's a pity that uncle is not here, now that mother-in-law has given birth to a child. Her body is more attractive than before. When uncle comes, I will ask him to compare them carefully to see whether this peach is more delicious or mother-in-law's peach is more attractive." Yosher's face flushed, and she spat, "Bah! You think about it yourself. But you have to use me to make trouble. But didn't Yun Yi say before that he would go back after I finish my confinement? Why hasn't he come for so long?" The first sentence was still complaining about Qin Keqing's fabrication of herself, but the second sentence sold her out. Qin Keqing complained, "Uncle is really something." The second aunt didn't forget to be considerate, "But mother-in-law has been holding it in for almost a year. Why doesn't she feel sorry for me this time?" Speaking of going back, Xiangling couldn't help but think of her son, and suddenly felt that the peach in her hand was not sweet anymore. Third sister Yu also took a bite of the freshly peeled peach, raised her hand to wipe the peach juice from the corner of her mouth, and curled her lips and said, "I think he is probably hooking up with some bastard wife again. No! The master must have something important." Second sister Yu glared at her sister and said, "We didn't stop the master from having affairs. So what's there to be shy about?" The first sentence was reasonable, but the second sentence was a bit off. However, it was the truth. Qin Keqing frowned and said, "If that's the case, send someone back to ask." As she was talking, she suddenly heard Qingwen's voice outside, "Oh no! Oh no! Something happened to the master." The few people who were chatting and laughing just now suddenly stood up. Qingwen rushed into the house and took a breath and said, "Just now I heard from Aunt Wu that many scholars gathered outside the city, saying that they came from Jiangnan and wanted to sue our master." "What?" Yu Erji and Yu Sanjia turned pale. Qin Keqing and Yusher frowned and said, "Tell me more about it. What's going on? Our master is related to scholars. Why would he come all the way to Beijing to file a complaint?" Rural women know little, and Wu Ma only heard it from hearsay. When it came to Qingwen, it changed the meaning. Yu Erji and Yu Sanjia were not like Yusher and Qin Keqing, who had limited knowledge and could hear the problem. "I don't know either. I heard that there was a problem with the bird droppings in the south, and they wanted to sue our master." Qingwen knew little, so she called Wu Ma again and asked for a long time. Although she roughly guessed that it was not a complaint, but an impeachment, she couldn't stay any longer after hearing this news. She didn't even bother to take her luggage with her. She took Zhang Zian and hurriedly got on the carriage back. Chapter 422, Relentless. Inside the Ascension Pavilion, Jean Chuan hummed a little tune and sang a song. Zhang Yuni had entered the Linshui pavilion for more than 2 hours. But he had not come out yet. She had gone there twice on time. But what she got was not an order, but the panting and rhythmic sounds again. The word jealousy did not exist in her dictionary. On the contrary, the longer mastery spent on Aunt Shui, the more it proved that her judgment was correct and that mastery had tickled her. This way of playing to his liking was indeed not wrong. Jean Chuan was secretly thinking about how mastery would praise her. Suddenly, she heard a burst of hurried footsteps approaching. She had just stopped humming a little tune, and saw the sisters of the Yu family, Qin Keqing, Xiangling and others rushing in. "Hey, why are the ants back? Where is the master?" the women said in unison. "This?" Jean Chuan's face changed drastically. "You didn't tell us about such a big thing. How long do you want to hide it from us? Tell me quickly. What happened to the master?" Jean Chuan said with a guilty look. "No. Nothing. Nothing. No. What time is it? Why is the master not at home?" After the beginning of summer, the days gradually get longer. Although it is not dark yet, it is already the 12th hour. "I'm here. I'm here," Jean Chuan said as she quietly touched the door. Then, she ran out quickly and turned back to shout, "Ants, wait here. I'll go find the master." How could they wait? Jean Chuan ran in front, and they chased after her. They chased each other, and came to Linshui Pavilion. Seeing that everyone was afraid that they couldn't wait for her to inform them, she ran to the gate of the courtyard and rushed inside, shouting at the top of her voice, "Master! Master! The concubines are back, and are looking for you." Hearing Jean Chuan shouting inside, Yushir and Qin Keqing paused and looked at each other. They knew very well that Wang Shifeng had lived here more than once. They thought to themselves, could it be that Wang Shifeng was so itchy that she came here to have an affair regardless of her pregnancy? When they hesitated, Yu Sanjia rushed to the front. Seeing that Yu Sanjia had already opened the door of the main hall, Yu Erji and Xiangling followed behind. The two of them could only glare at Jean Chuan helplessly, and said unhappily, "What's the big deal? Why are you so panicking?" Jean Chuan was stunned. But after thinking about their identities, she felt it was natural. However, her shout did not scare Zhang Yuni, who had too many lice and was not afraid of tickling. But it did scare Aunt Shui. She was frightened and her whole body tensed up. Zhang Yuni was stimulated by this and increased his strength. After being tortured for 2 hours, Aunt Shui's legs were already trembling. Now she couldn't even support herself and stumbled and collapsed on the edge of the bed. Before she had time to catch her breath, she heard the main door of the hall being pushed open suddenly. And then, the sound of chaotic footsteps approached, and she was immediately scared out of her wits. She didn't know where she got the strength from, but she quickly lay on the edge of the bed, stretched out her hand, grabbed the suspender skirt that Zhang Yuni had thrown away before, and put it on her head. The skirt had just been put on, and before she had time to put the hem down, the door was knocked open. Aunt Shui felt hopeless and fell to the ground with a thump. Third sister Yu pushed the door open, and a pungent smell of lewdness hit her in the face. She quickly held her breath, and before she could look inside, she heard Xiangling behind her exclaim, "Madam! Madam! You, what are you doing?" Third sister Yu looked into the room with a look of astonishment, and saw Aunt Shui sitting on the ground with her hairpins messy and her face in disarray. A large area of snow white exposed under her skirt, with crystal sweat beads hanging, formed a sharp contrast with the dark blue stone floor tiles. Aunt Shui was already plump, and she didn't have time to tidy up, so her skirt was not properly put on. Third sister Yu thought to herself that the 6-foot suspenders couldn't hold it, which was a great shame. She was amazed in her heart. When Yushir and Qin Keqing heard Xiangling's exclamation, one still remembered that Aunt Shui had withheld the profits of white sugar, and the other was watching the fun and didn't mind the big deal. So they squeezed in quickly, glancing at Aunt Shui who was lying on the ground. She said, "Uncle is really a fool. Why did he ask Aunt to sit on the ground?" Then, she turned her head to look at Jean Chuan and pretended to complain. "Why don't you explain it clearly? If we offend Aunt, how can we feel at ease?" Jean Chuan lowered her head and murmured, "Mr. Shui. Mr. Shui was arrested by Shantian Prefecture, and wants to ask Mr. Shui for help." Slave, slave! She wanted to shirk responsibility, but she couldn't speak in front of Zhang Yuni and Aunt Shui. Aunt Shui felt ashamed when she heard this. At first, she still remembered that her son was in prison. She planned to wait until Zhang Yuni was satisfied before asking for help. Unexpectedly, she forgot it. Although Zhang Yuni heard Jin Chuan shouting, he didn't think they would rush into the house directly. He could hear the embarrassment in Jin Chuan's words, so he naturally wouldn't push the responsibility onto a maid. He thought about it and quickly stepped forward to speak. But someone suddenly hugged his thigh from behind. He turned back in shock, only to see An Shui blushing and looking up and saying, Yun Yi, you must save Wen Long. Although Jin Chuan was worried that helping Zhang Yun Yi to flirt with other people would lead to being excluded by Yushur and others. But this step was just right. And An Shui seized the opportunity. Now that she was caught in the act, she couldn't cover it up. Although she had long forgotten the purpose of this trip, she could use it to cover up her shame at this moment. Even if she couldn't cover up the fact that she was caught cheating, she had an excuse for her son. In addition, she had been managing the family business for many years, and had been tainted with the habits of a businessman. At this time, she remembered that she hadn't mentioned saving Shui Pan yet. At present, the goods have been delivered in excess, but the request has not been mentioned. So I can't help but worry that Zhang Yuni will not admit it. In front of Yushur and others, Zhang Yuni can't be embarrassed to turn his face. At this point, he can't lose everything. Zhang Yuni grinned, showing a mouthful of white teeth, grabbed An Shui's arm on his legs, and pulled her up from the ground. Then he reached out and grabbed the ripe peach, held An Shui horizontally in his arms, and said with a smile, Don't worry, Aunt. I don't have many strengths, but I have always been very honest to my own people. Since we are already a family, I will naturally not ignore Wenlong's affairs. An Shui's actions. The mind is not difficult to guess. Anyway, the pot of taking advantage of others' misfortune has been taken, and it can't be taken for nothing. So he can't help but push it further. They are all his concubines and maids. Now he no longer hides his ambitions even from Lady Jia. So why should he hide it from them? Anyway, as long as he is not embarrassed, others will be embarrassed. So he followed the trend and followed An Shui's words to put this relationship on the table. Many things. Once the window paper is broken, there will be no psychological barriers in the future, and it will not be so embarrassing. For this reason, he deliberately nitpicked on the word strengths and emphasized the tone on own people and family. An Shui was held in his arms in public. Although she was a little embarrassed, she did not dare to push. The matter was already a louse on the bald head. Zhang Yuni not only took advantage of the situation, but also promised to help. She simply pretended to be submissive. However, although she thought well, Yushur and others did not know that the suspender skirt on her was the work of Jin Chuan. However, since Zhang Yuni had admitted it, Yushur and others were too embarrassed to expose it. Seeing that he had no intention of letting go, Yushur and Qin Keqing looked at each other, looked at An Shui in Zhang Yuni's arms, and hesitated to speak. She couldn't help but touch her back, stepped forward and said with a smile, In this case, then we won't disturb you and the aunt to discuss how to save people. After that, she opened her hands and pushed everyone out like holding a chicken. Yu Erji and Qin Keqing didn't say anything and took the initiative to retreat. Yu Sanjia pouted and was pushed out unwillingly. Xianwing, who had just woken up at this moment, glanced at An Shui, who buried her head in Zhang Yuni's chest like an ostrich, and walked out of the door in disbelief. When everyone filed out, Jin Chuan just poked her head in and looked inside with a guilty look. Zhang Yuni made An Shui, who was like a dead fish, kneel on the edge of the bed. He smiled and said, Don't worry, Auntie. I have already told you that Wenlong is doing well in Shutian Prefecture. Let's talk about this fake ginseng first. What is going on? Jin Chuan quickly stuck out her tongue and closed the door tightly. Chapter 423 Confession. After leaving Linshui Pavilion, third sister Yu said indignantly, We were worried all the way. But he still had the mind to flirt with others. If you want to ask, ask. I'm going back to the house first. After that, she went straight to Dofeng Pavilion without looking back. Although the situation in Linshui Pavilion was beyond everyone's expectations, they were relieved that Zhang Yuni was still interested in flirting with others, because they didn't know how much An Shui knew, and they didn't know whether Shui Pan really had any problems. They didn't say too much. An Shui was present in Linshui Pavilion, so it was not easy to ask. But when they returned to Dengxin Pavilion, they began to torture Jin Chuan. Many students from Jiangnan came to impeach the master. We all heard the news outside the city. You stay at home all day. Don't you know? Impeach the master? Jin Chuan woke up from a dream and said, "Could it be that they are the same as the ungrateful thing in the West Mansion?" "Who?" Qin Keqing asked hurriedly. "Isn't it the second master of the West Mansion?" Before the master came back, he went to the West Mansion to confront the old lady face to face, Jin Chuan said, and hurried to the room under the stairs, took out a memorial and handed it to everyone. Qin Keqing snatched it, and after reading it, she handed it to Yu Shi, and said with undisguised disgust, "This Jia family is really not a good person. One thing in front of you and another behind your back. When asking for help, they cleaned up the second wife and sent her to the master. And they were humble. But now they are adding insult to injury." Yu Erji and Qingwen on the side heard the words. Their eyes lit up, and they looked at Qin Keqing with gossip on their faces. Xiangling and Lu Wu obviously hadn't come to their senses yet. They lowered their heads in confusion for a while, then looked at her in horror. Yu Shi glanced at the memorial and said with an unpleasant face, "What did Yun Yi say?" Although Zhang Yun Yi had promised to take her as a concubine after the mourning period for her father was over, she was still the daughter-in-law of the Jia family. The master didn't have time to say it. He entered the palace today and brought this back. He also went to the West Mansion. Hearing that this memorial was brought back from the palace, Yu Shi and others felt relieved. Seeing that Jin Chuan couldn't get any information here, she turned to gossip and asked, "How soon will it be a concubine?" "How soon?" Jin Chuan muttered to herself, and then reacted. She did not hide anything, and told the story in a simple way, skipping only the foreshadowing she had made, and changed it to Shui Pan committing a crime. Zhang Yunyi went to Rong Mansion to question him, and was caught by Aunt Shui, so he came to ask for help. However, Yu Shi didn't believe it at all, and shouted, "Don't fool me. That nightgown is obviously made according to the concubine's figure. How could it be put on today?" What the servant said is absolutely true. Jin Chuan saw that she could not hide it anymore, so she had to tell the whole story. At the end, she added, the servant thought that the concubine was suffering from holding back, and the master had such an idea, so it was a perfect match. After saying that, she raised her head anxiously, but she saw Qin Keqing winking at her and smiling. "You are good at coaxing people, and know how to please them." She felt relieved immediately and said carefully, "It is my duty to satisfy the master." Everyone talked about this and that, and asked about the details for a while. About half an hour later, Zhang Yuli arrived at the Dangxian pavilion. As soon as he entered the door, he ordered Jin Chuan, "Go! Ask someone to get some water, and send it over, so that the concubine can wash before going back." Qin Keqing smiled and urged, "Since she is here, why rush to leave? Uncle might as well ask her to stay for 2 days." Zhang Yuni touched his nose awkwardly, and quickly changed the subject. "Why did you come back?" After he asked this, Qin Keqing also stopped joking. "If it weren't for Wu Ma's talk, we would still be in the dark." At that moment, everyone talked about the matter again. Yu Shi asked hurriedly, "What did the emperor say? What can happen?" Zhang Yudi waved his hand and said calmly, "Everyone who followed the trend and wrote a letter will get into trouble." He thought for a while and added, "Just know it in your heart. Don't spread it around." "How will Uncle deal with the West Mansion?" Qin Keqing said impatiently. "This time we have to teach them a lesson so that they will remember it for a long time." Zhang Yudi nodded, but said, "It's not the right time yet." He roughly talked about the remaining issues that the emperor wanted to deal with Yuan Chuan's marriage. The emperor didn't want to make a big deal, so he gave me the memorial. Qin Keqing's face flashed with disappointment when she heard the words, and then her eyes lit up. She looked at Zhang Yuni, and then looked at Yu Shi, and hesitated to speak. Zhang Yuni saw it, and understood what she meant. Qin Keqing knew about Lady Xing and Lady Wang, and she just wanted him to follow the example of Ningguo Mansion, and take over the mansion. This was indeed in line with his thoughts, and he nodded calmly. But he said, "Although we have to wait until the result of the disposal comes out, we have to remind the old lady first." The reason why he insisted on not giving up and severely tormented Aunt Shui again was not simply because he was not satisfied. Before that, he was so excited that he forgot about the ginseng for a while. After being reminded by Jin Chuan and Aunt Shui, he remembered it. Although Zhang Dehui and Shentian Prefecture confirmed that the fake ginseng sold was a lie by the clerk, the ginseng of Jiamu was also confiscated. After all, it was Aunt Shui who handled this matter, since Jiamu refused to accept the toast. He thought about asking around to see if he could involve Jiamu in it. Although Jiamu did everything perfectly, there was still room for use in this matter. After all, Wang Shifeng had reported the problem of the ginseng to Jiamu, and he and Jiamu knew it well. If they went to court, Jiamu could still deny it. But Zhang Yuni didn't need to go through so much trouble. He could just report the whole story to the emperor. On the one hand, Emperor Zhengqing had intended to let him control Rongwa Mansion, as long as he could take advantage of the situation. Even if it was just a little bit of a warning to Grandmother Jia. Grandmother Jia would be a little less confident when facing Zhang Yuni in the future. On the other hand, although the case of fake ginseng was clear, the Shui family was at most lax in restraint. But it was hard to guarantee that they would not be held accountable and taken advantage of. If he could get a clear way with the emperor, he would not have to worry about this in the future. At that moment, Zhang Yuni asked Qingwen to grind ink, and under the watch of Qin Keqing and others, he wrote the memorial and blew the ink on it dry. Ha ha! Qin Keqing sneered. The old lady is usually righteous, but she is so mean. A penny can kill a hero, let alone her. As they were talking, Jin Chuan came back and reported, Master, the concubine has been sent back. She hesitated for a moment and said, the concubine said that Master agreed to have someone take her to Shantian Prefecture to see Master Shui tomorrow. Yes. Zhang Yuni nodded, handed her the memorial he had just written and said, tomorrow. Ask Sierra to take her to Shantian Prefecture. And then ask him to send this memorial to the palace and give it to Eunuch Zhou. And ask him to help present it to the emperor. Shantian Prefecture needs to wait and see. And he also needs to conceal the emperor's attitude first, so as not to be on guard against the Ningguang family. In addition, since the fake ginseng matter is to be reported to the emperor, how to deal with it must wait for the emperor's will. Therefore, he does not intend to get Shui Pan out immediately. Anyway, Li Mingyuan has already made arrangements, and Shui Pan will not suffer, so it is better to let him stay in prison for a while. Even so, Aunt Shui was still worried. She would not feel at ease if she did not let her see Shui Pan. So, this arrangement was made.